Vernon Slate didn't knock. He never knocked. That January morning, he kicked open the door to the cattleman's credit office in Billings, slapped a leather folder on the desk, and said to the banker behind it, calm as a man ordering breakfast, call the Rourke debt. All of it now. The banker hesitated. Slate leaned forward. I'm not asking. 300 miles away, in a ranch house so cold the water in the kitchen basin had frozen solid overnight, a woman named Maeve Calder was dragging an unconscious man toward a fireplace that had almost no wood left to burn. She didn't know about Slate. She didn't know about the debt. She didn't even know the man's name yet. All she knew was that he was dying, and that she was the only one there to stop it. If you were her, standing in that frozen doorway, carrying nothing but a battered cookbook and $2.03, what would you do? Before we go further, if stories like this speak to something deep in you, hit that subscribe button right now and ring the bell. I put my heart into every single story I tell, and I'd hate for you to miss what's coming next. And when you're done watching, drop a comment with your city and country. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to that frozen doorway. The position wasn't advertised in any newspaper. Word of mouth in a dying cattle town in the winter of 1886 wasn't exactly a reliable system, but it was the only one Maeve Calder had access to. And when old Mrs. Hartley at the dry goods counter mentioned almost as an afterthought, almost as a warning that Sizzless Rourke out at Red Willow was in a bad way and needed somebody to cook and keep house through January, Maeve had nodded once and asked how far the ranch was. Far enough you shouldn't try walking it, Mrs. Hartley said. Maeve asked if there was another way to get there. There wasn't. She left the next morning before light. She wasn't the type of woman who second-guessed herself into paralysis. Her mother had been that kind of woman. And Maeve had watched it grind her down to nothing over 30 years of small hesitations. Maeve had learned early that a decision made badly was still better than one never made at all. So she wrapped her feet in 2 pairs of wool stockings, packed her mother's cookbook into the canvas bag beside her last clean apron, and walked into the kind of cold that makes a person feel like the air itself has turned against them. Montana in January had a particular cruelty to it. The wind didn't blow in any one direction, it came from everywhere at once, pressing through coat fabric and hat wool and boot leather like it was personally offended by anything warm. Maeve set her jaw and walked. She counted fence posts when she could see them. She counted her breaths when she couldn't. She had been walking for what she guessed was 3 hours, though the cloud cover made it impossible to know for certain when the snow started. Not a gentle snow, not the kind that settles lightly and makes everything look clean and quiet. This was the kind of snow that moved horizontally, that cut at the skin of her face, that turned the road she'd been following into something indistinguishable from everything beside it. Maeve stopped walking. She would not say later that she was frightened, because frightened wasn't quite the right word. Calculating. There was a difference. Standing still in that kind of cold was a death sentence. Moving forward when she couldn't see where forward was could also be a death sentence. She stood in that blizzard for exactly long enough to think through her options, and then she kept walking. She was ranch by feel more than sight, the way the ground changed slightly under her feet, the way a structure interrupts winds, even when you can't see it. The ranch house came out of the white, nothing like an argument she hadn't expected to find. The door was frozen shut. She hit it with her shoulder twice. Then she stepped back, planted her feet, and hit it with everything she had. It opened. The smell hit her first, not the smell of a sick man, though that was part of it. It was the smell of a house that had given up. Wood smoke so old it had gone cold. Something soured in a pot on a dead stove. Unwashed wool and dried blood, and the particular staleness that sets in when nobody has opened a window in weeks because the cold outside is worse than the decay within. Silas Rourke was on the floor beside the kitchen table. He was breathing. She could see that much from the doorway, but barely. He was a big man, or had been once. Now he looked like something that had been emptied. His skin had the grayish-yellow color of old candle wax. His lips were cracked and dry. He was burning with fever so intense that even across the room she could feel it. Maeve stood there for 1 full second. 1 second was all she allowed herself. Then she crossed the room, dropped to her knees beside him, and pressed her hand against his forehead. The heat was alarming. His eyes fluttered but didn't open. I'm going to need to move you, she said, though she wasn't sure he could hear her. She'd learned early on that talking to someone, even when they couldn't respond, kept her own hands steadier. You're going to hate it. I'm sorry about that in advance. Getting Silas Rourke across a kitchen floor and near enough to the fireplace to matter was one of the hardest physical things Maeve had done in a life that included more than a fair share of hard physical things. He outweighed her by at least 70 pounds, all of it dead weight. She got him moving by degrees, rolling him, pulling him by his coat collar, repositioning herself, pulling again. By the time she had him where she wanted him, every muscle in her back and arms was screaming. She didn't stop. The fireplace had a little wood left. Not much. She got a fire started, then went looking for more. The woodpile outside was inadequate for what she needed, but it would do for tonight. She brought in 3 loads, stacking them the way her father had taught her, largest pieces at the back. Small pieces forward for quick heat. Her father had taught her a great many practical things before he died, and she had stored all of them somewhere she could reach quickly. She got water boiling. She found a pot that hadn't entirely gone to ruin and washed it as best she could. She found dried herbs hanging near a back window, sage, thyme, something that might have been chamomile, and pulled them down. She found, in the back of a cabinet so far pushed to the wall she had to stand on her toes to reach it, a small cache of dried beans. The pantry was nearly empty. Not entirely, but nearly. Maeve stood inside it for a long moment, taking stock. Aging flour, a small sack of cornmeal, the dried beans, 3 aging onions that had gone soft in spots but were salvageable if you were careful, the dried herbs, a tin of salt, 1 side of smoked meat hanging from a hook, old but intact. On the floor, shoved so far to the back that whoever had put it there had probably forgotten it existed, a canvas bag containing cattle bones, probably saved from a slaughter weeks or months ago. Most people would have looked at that pantry and felt the fear spread through them like floodwater. Maeve felt something closer to impatience. You start where you are. That was if its windows were dark. That was another thing her mother had written in the front of the cookbook, not a recipe. Just a sentence in her mother's cramped, careful handwriting. You start where you are, and you use what you have. Her mother had been, in most things, a woman crippled by hesitation. But in a kitchen, she'd been someone else entirely. In a kitchen, she'd been magnificent. Maeve pulled out the bones and got them in water. Good broth takes time. She didn't have time the way she'd prefer, so she worked with the time she had high heat until it came to a boil, then lower, a long simmer, the herbs going in slowly, the flavors coaxed out of things that looked like they had nothing left to give. While the broth simmered, she went back to Silas. His breathing had evened slightly, not much, but enough. She got a wet cloth on his were dark. Scocking for forehead and changed each every few minutes, talking to him the whole time in the low, unhurried voice she'd used with her mother during her last winter. Not comforting words exactly, just words. The weather outside, what she'd found in the pantry, the recipe for the broth she was making. She'd learned that the voice mattered as much as the words, that a steady voice was itself a kind of medicine. Around the time the broth had been on 3 hours, she heard the door. She thought first it was the wind. Then she heard it again, a deliberate knock, the sound of a person who wasn't sure whether to come in or go away. The man who stepped inside was taller than his father, though the resemblance was there in the jaw and in the stubborn set of the shoulders. He stopped when he saw Maeve. He looked at her, then past her at the fire, at his father on the floor beside it, at the pot simmering on the revived stove. His expression went through several things quickly. Surprise, then something defensive. "Who are you?" he said. Not a question, more like the start of an accusation he hadn't decided how to finish. Maeve Calder. Mrs. Hartley sent word you needed a cook. She stood up from where she'd been crouching beside Silas, wiping her hands on her apron. You're his son, Gideon Rourke. He was still standing near the door, which he hadn't bothered to close all the way. How long has he been like that? I don't know. I found him when I arrived. A few hours ago. Gideon looked at his father. Something moved across his face that wasn't easy to name, not grief exactly, not guilt exactly, but something in the territory between them. He was like this when you got here, and you didn't go for the doctor? The blizzard's worse now than when I walked in, Maeve said, keeping her voice even. Riding out in that to find a doctor who may or may not be available while your father lies here with a fever that high. That's how you end up with 2 problems instead of 1. The broth will help him through tonight. His breathing is more stable than it was 3 hours ago. If the storm breaks by morning, we get the doctor. Tonight we manage. Gideon looked at her for a long moment. Close the door, she said. You're letting the cold in. Closed it. He stood in the kitchen and didn't know what to do with himself. That much was obvious. Kept looking at his father and then looking away, as if holding the sight of him too long cost something. He wrote me, Gideon said finally. He wasn't talking to her, exactly more like talking, because the silence had become heavier than the words. He said he was fine. Said everything was fine. 3 months ago. He stopped. He didn't write again after that. Did you write back? Pause. Once. Maeve didn't say anything. She went back to the stove and checked the broth, tasting it off the spoon and adjusting the salt. Behind her, she could hear Gideon trying to figure out where he fit in his father's, which was the particular quiet of a man who'd been gone long enough that everything familiar had gotten slightly wrong. It smells good, he said. It'll be better in another hour. I didn't think there was anything in that pantry. There wasn't much, Maeve said. But much isn't the same as nothing. He sat down at the kitchen table not gracefully, more like someone whose legs had made the decision before his pride could object. He looked exhausted in the specific way of a man who hadn't been sleeping and wouldn't admit it. His coat was still on. He had the look of a man who'd arrived with the intention of staying only as long as necessary and was now not sure what necessary meant. How long has the ranch been like this? Maeve asked. She didn't look at him. It was easier to answer things honestly when nobody was watching your face. A year, maybe. More. I don't know exactly. He turned his hat in his hand. She could hear the sound of it, the quiet, nervous rotation. He stopped asking for help a long time ago. Silas Rourke doesn't ask for help. He wrote to Mrs. Hartley. Mrs. Hartley is different. She's been here longer than any of us. He set the hat down on the table. Debt's bad. The cattle operation is in the ground. The hands left in October couldn't pay them. There's talk in town about the bank. What kind of talk? He didn't answer right away. The kind you don't want to hear about the bank, he said. Maeve brought a cup of broth to where Silas lay, got behind him carefully, and worked her arm under his shoulders to lift him just enough. He made a sound, not words, not quite a groan, something in between. Silas, she said, clear and close to his ear, I need you to drink a little. You don't have to wake up all the way. Just drink. Drank. It was small, barely anything. But it was something. Gideon watched from the table and didn't speak. Later, when the broth had done what broth can do, on the first night, when Silas's fever had lowered enough that his breathing was no longer frightening, when the fire was stoked and the kitchen was warm enough that the frozen feeling in Maeve's fingers had finally let go, Gideon came to stand near his father and looked down at him in the uncertain way of a son who didn't know if he still had the right. Is he going to make it? Gideon asked. I think so, Maeve said. Tonight wasn't as close as it might have been, but it was close. Yes, she said, it was close. Gideon nodded. He didn't say anything. He didn't thank her. She hadn't expected him to. Men like him usually took longer to get there. She went to find where she'd be sleeping. The house was cold and dark in the way that old, unhappy houses get not just temperature, but something else, something stored in the walls the way cold stores in stone. She found a small room off the kitchen that must have been a former storeroom, set her canvas bag down on the narrow cot inside it, and sat on the edge of it for the first time since she'd walked through the door. Her whole body ached. She pulled her mother's cookbook from the bag and held it in her lap without opening it. The cover was stained with 30 years of kitchen use grease and flour, and something red that had never entirely washed out. She'd carried it so long it had begun to feel less like a book and more like a part of her hand. On the floor of that cold little room, she allowed herself exactly as much doubt as she could afford, which was some, but not all. This ranch was in trouble. Real trouble. Not the kind you cook your way out of in a few weeks. The son who'd come back hadn't come back with hope. He'd come back with the specific look of a man who'd arrived to witness a death he'd expected from far away. The pantry was nearly empty. The debt was bad. Something about the bank. But Silas was breathing better than he had been 3 hours ago. The broth was good. The fire was holding. Maeve opened the cookbook to the first page, to her mother's handwriting, and read the sentence she'd read 1,000 times before. You start where you are, and you use what you have. She closed the book. She lay down on the narrow cot in her coat because there were no extra blankets she'd found yet. She stared at the ceiling, listening to the blizzard outside, arguing with the walls of the house. She didn't know about Vernon Slate. Not yet. She didn't know about the banker in Billings, or the leather folder, or the calm, cold order that had already been set in motion 300 miles away. She didn't know that the man who wanted this land had wanted it for years, had been slowly poisoning it from the outside, the way a patient hunter waits at a waterhole, not with urgency, but with certainty. She didn't know any of that. What she knew was this. Somewhere across the narrow hall, an old man's lungs were working steadily for the first time in days. A son who'd stood at the edge of his father's house, like someone who didn't know if he could come in, was sitting at the kitchen table, in the dark. And in the morning, there would be things to be done, and she would do them. Red Willow was not dead yet. She closed her eyes. Outside, the blizzard reached its loudest pitch, the kind of howl that sounds less like wind and more like something with intention, and then slowly, imperceptibly, it began to ease. The morning after the blizzard was the kind of quiet that feels earned. Not peaceful, exactly more like the world had fought itself to exhaustion and was lying still, catching its breath. The snow had stopped somewhere before dawn, and what it left behind was a landscape so white and undifferentiated that the fence posts at the edge of the yard looked like punctuation marks in a sentence nobody had finished writing. Maeve was already at the stove when Gideon came into the kitchen. She'd been up since before light, not because she'd slept well, but because lying on that narrow cot listening to the house settle and creak had stopped being useful around 4 in the morning. She'd gotten up, added wood to the fire, checked on Silas, and then stood in the pantry for a long time with a lamp, rethinking everything she'd assessed the night before. The cattle bones had given up what they had. The broth was good, better than good, actually, given what she'd worked with. She'd strained it overnight, and it had set into a rich, trembling jelly in the cold of the back room, which meant the gelatin content was high, which meant it would do real work in a sick man's body. She'd set a portion back on the stove to warm, before Gideon appeared in the doorway. He stopped when he saw her. He looked like a man who'd expected to walk into an empty kitchen and instead found evidence that someone else had been living a whole life in it while he wasn't paying attention. He drank more in the night, Maeve said without turning around. Twice, his fever's down, not gone, but down. Gideon crossed to where his father lay. Still on the floor near the fireplace, she hadn't been able to move him to a bed by herself, and she'd decided that warm and on the floor was better than cold and in a bed. He crouched down and looked at Silas for a long moment. He put his hands against his father's forehead the same way she had, and something about the gesture struck her as the most honest thing she'd seen him do since he'd walked in. "You're right," he said. "He's cooler. I'll need your help getting him to a bed this morning. And then I need to know what's actually in the outbuildings." Gideon stood up. "Why the outbuildings?" "Because I've gone through the kitchen and the pantry, and I know what's in there. I don't know what's out there." She finally turned to look at him. He hadn't shaved, and the exhaustion she'd seen on his face the night before had settled in more deeply, the way exhaustion does when sleep doesn't actually fix it. "If I'm going to keep cooking for this household through the winter, I need to do a full accounting. I don't work well with unknowns." He almost said something sharp. She could see it start, and then he stopped himself. She got the sense that wasn't entirely natural for him. That stopping himself was a skill he'd had to learn the hard way. "There's a smokehouse," he said. "Some preserved meat left. Not a lot. Root cellar on the east side of the barn. I haven't been in it since I got back." "When did you get back?" 4 days ago." She waited. "I came because he stopped writing," Gideon said. He moved to the table and sat in the same chair he'd used the night before, like he'd already claimed it without deciding to. "I wasn't going to. I'd told myself the ranch was his business, that he'd made his choices and I'd made mine, and that was that." He rubbed the back of his neck. 7 years is a long time to be wrong about something. Maeve poured 2 cups of coffee. She'd found a small tin of grounds in the back of a cabinet. Not much left, but enough for a few days if she was careful, and set one in front of him without being asked. He looked at it, then at her. "Thank you. Don't thank me. Tell me what happened between you and him." It wasn't a polite question. She knew it wasn't. But she'd found that people in crisis burned enormous energy, managing the edges of things, skirting around the real weight, carrying it sideways instead of straight. and that energy was better spent on practical problems. If she was going to be in this house, she needed to understand what she'd walked into. Gideon wrapped both hands around the cup and stared at it. He wanted to run the ranch a certain way. I wanted to change it. He stopped. We're both stubborn. You'll notice that about him when he wakes up enough to argue. What kind of changes did you want? Expansion. Taking on more cattle, more land. Working with some of the other ranches to negotiate better prices with the buyers from Billings. He shook his head. He thought I was reckless. I thought he was too proud to admit the old way wasn't working anymore. We said things. He paused. He said one thing in particular, and I left. What did he say? Another pause, longer this time. He said I had my mother's habit of wanting more than what was in front of me. Gideon's voice stayed flat, but it cost him something. She died wanting things she never got. He meant it as a warning. I heard it as an insult. Maeve drank her coffee. She didn't try to fix what he'd just said. That was another thing she'd learned. Some things didn't need fixing. They needed witnessing. Maybe it was both, she said finally. He looked at her then, not offended, more like someone who'd expected a different response and wasn't sure what to do with the one he got. From near the fireplace, Silas made a sound. They both turned. His eyes were open barely, cracked to thin lines against the light, and he was looking at the ceiling with the unfocused expression of a man who'd been somewhere far away and wasn't fully back yet. Silas, Maeve said, moving to him. She kept her voice level. You've got a fever. You've been on the floor. I'm going to help you sit up in a minute. His eyes moved toward her. They focused, slowly, like a long exposure photograph developing. Who, he said. His voice was barely a sound. Maeve Calder. Cook. Mrs. Hartley sent me. She paused. Your son is also here. His eyes moved past her. Gideon had come to stand at the edge of the fireplace, and father and son looked at each other across the space of 7 years, and one cold kitchen floor, and neither of them said anything, and the silence had more in it than most conversations Maeve had ever witnessed. It was Silas who looked away first. He closed his eyes. Stubborn boy, he murmured. It might have been an insult. It might have been something else. Maeve decided not to interpret it. Drink this first, she said, and brought the warm broth. Getting Silas off the floor and into his bed took all three of them. Silas conscious enough to manage his own legs in a limited way, Maeve on one side, Gideon on the other, none of it graceful, all of it necessary. Silas cursed twice. Gideon almost dropped him once going through a doorway and said something under his breath that wasn't a prayer. Maeve told them both to be quiet and focus. By the time Silas was horizontal, on his own mattress with 2 blankets, and the warm broth on the table beside him, all of them were breathing hard. You've got a doctor, Maeve said to Gideon. Ride for him this morning while the snow's passable. Tell him the fever's been at least 3 days, probably more. Gideon went. She spent the time he was gone doing the accounting she'd said she needed. The smokehouse had more than she'd expected: 3 good sides of smoked pork, a wrapped venison haunch, and a collection of smaller cuts she'd need to assess more carefully. The root cellar was the real surprise. Whoever had stocked it, probably Silas himself, in a better season had put up more than the chaos of the kitchen suggested. Dried apples, carrots gone soft but workable, a crock of something brined that turned out to be cabbage, onions, 2 kinds of dried beans, and in the back corner, wrapped in cloth and sitting in a woods crate as though someone had put it there deliberately and carefully, 6 jars of preserved apple preserves with a handwritten label that read only E. Arcept, 1,879. Maeve stood in the cold of the root cellar, holding one of those jars and looking at the initials and the date. E.R. Silas's wife, dead some years now. She didn't know the whole story yet, but she knew what those jars meant. She'd watched her own mother put up preserves every fall with the same kind of careful attention, the same understanding that you were putting part of the summer away for the dark months, that you were betting on a future you couldn't see yet. She put the jar back exactly as she'd found it and went back to the kitchen. By the time Gideon returned with the doctor, a compact, gray-haired man named Ellison who spoke in short declarative sentences and wasted nothing. Maeve had a proper meal going: salt pork with the soft carrots, cornmeal bread, baking on the back of the stove, and a fresh pot of broth with a handful of the dried herbs that smelled like something almost hopeful. Dr. Ellison spent 20 minutes with Silas's and came out with the expression of a man who'd been braced for worse news than he had. Lungs are bad, but not broken, he said. He'd have been dead in another 2 or 3 days if the fever hadn't come down. He looked at Maeve with the specific regard of a man recalibrating an assumption. What did you give him? Bone broth. Sage and thyme. Kept him warm. The broth was more important than anything I could have ridden out here with. He closed his bag. Keep doing what you're doing. Watch the fever. Get him eating something solid when he'll take it. He looked at Gideon. He needs rest. Which means you need to manage whatever this ranch needs managing without asking him about it. Can you do that? Gideon said yes with the confidence of a man who wasn't entirely sure. The doctor left. The kitchen settled back into its working silence. That silence lasted about 4 days. Silas was a miserable patient. He'd been alone long enough that he'd lost whatever tolerance he'd once had for being managed, and Maeve's calm, consistent management of his meals and his rest and his medication schedule grated on him in a way he expressed primarily through complaints about the temperature of his food and the frequency with which she appeared in his doorway. I can eat by myself, he said on the 3rd day, when she'd brought his noon meal and waited to make sure he was actually eating it rather than setting it aside the moment she left. I know you can, she said. Eat. I've been eating by myself for 61 years. And yet you weigh 20 pounds less than you should, and the doctor said your hands are shaking from malnutrition. So eat. He stared at her. Then he ate. Gideon appeared in the doorway of his father's room during this exchange and had the good sense not to smile. But she caught the corner of it anyway as he turned away. And she filed that away somewhere, not because it mattered exactly, but because it was the first time she'd seen his face do something easy. The ranch work was brutal, and Gideon was doing most of it alone. The handful of cattle remaining needed water and feed in weather that made every trip to the barn a small battle. Equipment that had been poorly maintained through the fall because Silas had been sick longer than anyone had known needed attention that took hours. Gideon came in at midday with hands so cold he couldn't properly grip a fork, and Maeve started leaving a basin of warm water by the door so he could get his hands workable before sitting down to eat. He didn't mention it. She didn't mention it. It became part of the daily shape of things. What she noticed was that he'd stopped hesitating at the door. The first few days, he'd come in like a man, checking whether he was allowed. Now he came in with the specific forward motion of someone who knew where he was going. That was a small thing. But small things in a household going wrong tend to mean more than they appear to. It was on the 6th day, Silas well enough to sit up in a chair by his window, Gideon in from the morning chores, the 3 of them eating together for the first time that Maeve heard the name Vernon Slate for the first time. Gideon mentioned it the way you mention something you think everyone already knows. He was talking about the cattle buyers, about the problems getting fair prices the previous fall, and he said, Slate's people were in Billings again. Word is he's been buying up water rights north of here. Silas went very still. It was a subtle stillness, not the stillness of a sick man conserving energy, but the specific stillness of someone who'd heard a name they'd been dreading in a context they'd been afraid of. Maeve was watching him. She wasn't sure why something in his face had shifted, some register she didn't have a name for yet, when Silas said, I heard it before I came out here. From a man in town. Gideon looked up from his plate. He'd seen his father's face too. You know him? Slate? I know of him, Silas said carefully. What does that mean? It means I know of him. Silas picked up his spoon. Don't worry about Slate. It was the exact wrong thing to say to his son, and Silas probably knew it. Gideon put down his own spoon. You just told me not to worry about a land speculator buying water rights north of a ranch that's drowning in debt. Give me a reason not to worry. He's not our problem. How do you know? Because I've kept him out of our business for 3 years, and I'll keep doing it. Gideon leaned forward. 3 years. He's been around this ranch for 3 years, and you never wrote me about it. I handled it. You handled it so well, you ended up on the kitchen floor with a fever that almost killed you. The silence that followed was the kind that fills with all the things people don't say, because they've decided the ones they've already said are enough damage for one meal. Maeve stood up and took her plate to the kitchen. She gave them 4 minutes. Then she came back with more cornbread because the silence had gone on long enough, and food was a useful interruption. Who is Vernon Slate? She asked, sitting back down. She addressed the question to neither of them specifically, which meant both of them had to decide whether to answer it. Silas answered first. Denver man. Made money in land and water rights in the 70s. He's been moving into Montana the last 5 years, buying ranches that are in trouble. Buying them or taking them? Both, Silas said, depending on how he defines the difference. He's been around this ranch specifically for 3 years, Maeve said. It wasn't a question. He made an offer I refused. He made another. I refused again. What happened after the second refusal? Silas didn't answer. Gideon was watching his father with an expression that was somewhere between anger and something rawer, the specific look of someone who was understanding something they'd been prevented from understanding before. Supplier credit problem, he said slowly, last fall. When the feed supplier wouldn't extend us credit, and the line of credit at the bank got cut by a third. He stopped. That was him. Silas still didn't answer, which was itself an answer. He's been running you down from the outside, Gideon said. Poisoning the credit, cutting the reputation, waiting for you to get desperate enough to sell cheap. I wasn't going to sell. You were on the kitchen floor, Dad. The word Dad, not Silas. Not the stiff formality he'd been using since his arrival landed somewhere in the room and changed it slightly. The way a stone dropped in, still water changes the whole surface. Silas looked at his son for a long moment. No, he said. I wasn't going to sell. It was the truth. Maeve believed it. But she also understood, in the particular way of someone trained to look at a pantry and see both what was present and what was missing, that the truth wasn't enough on its own. She spent that night after the men had gone to sleep, sitting at the kitchen table with a lamp and thinking through what she knew. She had the habit of putting things in order when they felt disordered. It was something her father had taught her, the surveyor's instinct, the idea that the world made more sense when you mapped it carefully rather than just moving through it, feeling the terrain. Slate had been working on the ranch's reputation and its finances. Supplier credit was gone. The bank credit had been cut. The cattle operation was not producing enough revenue to service the debt. Silas had been sick and alone and managing all of this without asking for help, which meant he'd been losing ground quietly, by degrees, in the way that isolation always costs you. The ranch wasn't dead, but it was being made to look dead. There was a difference, and she kept turning it over. In the morning, there was bread to make. She made it. She made it well. Without overthinking it, the good yeast smell of it, working, filled the kitchen by 7, and when Gideon came in from feeding the cattle, he stopped inside the door and breathed it in, involuntarily, the way certain smells get past every defense a person has constructed. Bread, he said, as if announcing it. Cornbread yesterday wasn't enough for you? Cornbread is not bread. I'll put that on your gravestone. He sat us down at the table, and there was no hesitation in it at all. Most of its windows were dark. She noticed that the way she'd noticed the warm water basin had started being used without comment, the way she'd noticed him refilling the woodpile without being asked. The house was doing what houses do when people start taking care of them. It was slowly coming back. It was 2 days later that Gideon told her, almost by accident, about the letter he'd written to Slate. He hadn't meant to tell her. She could see that. She could see that in the way he said it sideways as part of a larger conversation about the debt schedule, in a tone that was carefully neutral in the way of someone who'd rehearsed the neutrality and still hadn't quite got it right. He said he'd contacted Slate's office before he'd come to the ranch, when he'd been far away and looking at the situation, the particular distortion that distance produces. That selling was the practical choice. The ranch was too far gone. That his father, when he died, would be better off with cash than with a failing property. He said all of this to the table rather than to her. Maeve was quiet for long enough that he looked up. I didn't know, he said, about what he was doing. Thought it was just a bad run, bad luck and bad decisions. I know you didn't know, she said. That doesn't make it better. No, she agreed, it doesn't. But it changes what you do next. He looked at her. What do I do next? You write another letter. She met his eyes. You tell him you're no longer interested in a sale. You don't explain. You don't apologize. You just close the door. That might make him move faster. If he knows the family is united. He already knows the family isn't united. He's been counting on it. She kept her voice steady. The best thing you can do for this ranch right now is make him uncertain about something he thought he had figured out. Gideon sat with that. You're not what I expected, he said. When I walked in that first night. What did you expect? I don't know. Somebody who'd make soup and leave. I'm still here, she said. and went back to the bread. He wrote the letter that afternoon. She didn't read it, she hadn't asked to, and he hadn't offered. But she heard him seal it, and she saw his face when he came out of the small room where he'd written it, and the expression on it was the particular expression of someone who'd done something that couldn't be undone, and had decided they were at peace with that. Silas improved daily. Not in a straight line, there were bad mornings, days when the fever crept back enough to scare her, one bad afternoon when his cough deepened, and she spent 4 hours sitting near him in case it got worse. But the general direction was upward. By the second week, he was eating actual meals. By the end of the second week, he was arguing with Gideon about the fencing on the north pasture in a way that, while not entirely pleasant to witness, indicated a functioning mind and a returned will to interfere in his own ranch's operations. They were, she saw, very similar people who had a shared gift for saying the wrong true thing at the wrong moment. "You're going to have to find a way to work together," she told Gideon one evening when he'd come into the kitchen after an argument with his father and stood at the window not speaking. "I've been here 2 weeks, and we've already had 15 arguments. How many of them did you start?" A pause. "More than I'd like to count. He's been alone for 3 years doing this by himself. He's got habits of solving things alone that are going to be hard to break." She began cutting the pork for the next day's dinner. "And you've got habits of being somewhere else that aren't all that different, really. How is being somewhere else the same as being here and not asking for help?" "Same result," she said. "The ranch still didn't have either of you." He went quiet. "I'm not criticizing," she said. "I'm telling you what I see. You can do what you like with it." She heard him breathe out long, slow, the exhalation of someone releasing something they'd been carrying at the wrong angle. When he said what he said, Gideon said, "About my mother wanting more than what she had. I've been thinking about that." He turned from the window. Maybe he was scared. For me. Maybe he said it badly because he was scared-eyed. He stopped. "She wasn't happy here. I know that. I was a kid, but I knew it. She wanted things to be different, and they never got different enough. And then she was gone." His voice stayed level, but I think he was trying to warn me not to end up wanting something so far away from here that I'd lose what was right in front of me. Maeve stopped cutting. She looked at him. "That's the most charitable interpretation," she said. "Maybe it's the right one. Maybe it is." She went back to the pork. "You could tell him that's how you heard it now." "I could. He won't say much back, but he'll hear it." "How do you know?" "Because he drinks his broth every morning, and he knows it didn't get better by magic." Gideon looked at her for a moment with an expression she'd seen growing in small increments over 2 weeks, a kind of attention that was different from the general attention of living in the same house. She didn't name it, because naming things before they were ready to be named was the faster way to ruin them, and she'd learned that in the particular hard way of someone who'd made the mistake before. She just kept cutting the pork. The idea for the dinner came to her the way most of her ideas came, not in one flash, but in pieces that assembled themselves while her hands were doing something else. She'd been in town with Gideon to settle a small account at the dry goods store when she'd overheard 2 ranchers talking about Red Willow. She hadn't been meant to hear. She'd been standing on the other side of a shelf of canned goods, and the men hadn't known she was there, and they'd said, in the ordinary voices of people sharing information they believed, that the Rourke place was finished, that Silas was probably dead by now, that the bank would have it by spring. She stood behind that shelf and listened to 2 men consigning a living ranch to its grave, and something in her went completely and quietly cold. She didn't say anything to them. She didn't come around the shelf. She picked up the canned tomatoes she'd come for, and she went to find Gideon, and she was quiet on the ride back. "What happened?" he said, because by now he'd learned to read her quiet. "Tell me the names of the ranches within a half-day's ride," she said. He listed them. 6 families. The Harpers, the Calloway spread, the Voss family, the McIntyre operation, the 2 smaller outfits to the south. "When's the last time any of them were at Red Willow for something social?" He thought about it. "Before I left. 7 years. We're having a dinner," she said. He looked at her sideways. "What?" "With what we have." She pulled her coat tighter against the cold coming off the fields. "We have enough. If I plan it right. Maeve, we're fighting a bank debt and a land speculator, and my father just got well enough to stand up without help 3 days ago. Which is exactly why we're having a dinner." She looked at him directly. Slate's greatest advantage is that everyone thinks this ranch is already dead. You want to fight that from the inside, from behind the walls? You cannot win that way. You have to bring people here, let them see Silas alive, and the kitchen warm and the table set. You have to make them remember what Red Willow is. And what is Red Willow? She looked back at the road ahead. That's what the dinner is for, she said, to remind them, and while you're at it, to remind yourselves. He was quiet for a long mile. My father is going to say no, he said. Your father, she said, has been saying no to everything for 3 years, and it's gotten him flat on a kitchen floor. He can say no all he wants. I'll cook anyway. Gideon made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. It was near things to one she'd heard from him since the night she'd arrived, and it landed somewhere unexpected in her chest, surprising her with its weight. She stored that away too, carefully, in the place where she kept things that needed more time before she looked at them again. Silas said no the first time she brought it up. He said no the second time more emphatically, with a point made about the state of the house and the state of the table linen and the state of his finances and what people would think. Maeve listened to all of it and then said, the table linen can be washed. What people think is the whole point, and your finances will be better served by 30 witnesses to your continued existence than by your continued hiding. He looked at her with the particular look he developed for her, half exasperation and half something that didn't have a name yet, something that recognized itself in her without entirely wanting to. You're going to do it whether I agree or not, he said. I'd prefer your agreement, she said. But yes. He waved his hand in the approximate direction of the whole enterprise. It wasn't a yes. It wasn't quite a no anymore either. She started planning. What she could make from what they had was a question she turned over for 3 days with the same methodical attention she'd brought to every pantry she'd ever managed. The smoked pork, the preserved vegetables, the dried beans reconstituted and seasoned, the root vegetables from the cellar roasted to bring out what sweetness the winter had left in them, cornbread in quantity, a broth-based soup that would serve as the first course and do double duty warming people who'd ridden in cold, and something sweet for the end, not much, but something, because a meal without sweetness at the end didn't signal the same thing. She thought about the jars in the root cellar. She thought about the handwriting. E.R. Sept. 1879. She left them where they were for now. Some things needed more thought before you decided what to do with them. The invitations went out through Gideon, who rode to each neighboring ranch over 2 days, and personally extended them. Not a note, not a word passed through an intermediary, but Gideon Rourke sitting across from each family and saying, with the directness she'd specifically requested, that his father was recovered, that Red Willow was not what the rumors said, and that there would be a supper on Saturday week, and the Rourkes would be glad of their company. He came back from the last visit on the second day, looking like a man who'd been challenged in every house, and hadn't entirely expected to feel good about it. Most of them said yes, he said. Most? The Harpers said they'd see, which is Harper for probably. He came into the kitchen and stood near the stove the way he'd started to do in the evenings, not for warmth exactly, more for the company of it. Cal Voss asked me straight out whether the bank was calling the debt. What did you tell him? I told him the debt was being managed. He looked at her. That wasn't a lie exactly. No, she agreed, it wasn't. She handed him a cup of coffee. Good. He took the cup and was quiet for a moment. Some of them looked at me like they felt sorry for me, he said. Like I was doing this out of desperation, and they were too polite to say it. Some of them probably were. Doesn't that bother you? Not particularly. She went back to the counter where she'd been working on the dinner plan, a list of dishes written out in her precise handwriting. People are allowed to feel sorry for things that look like they're failing. What they're not allowed is to decide they're right without being shown otherwise. She looked up. That's what Saturday is for. Gideon looked at her list. He leaned forward slightly to read it, close enough that she was aware of how little space there was between them in the kitchen, in the way you become aware of something that's been true for a while and just now asks to be noticed. She didn't move. Neither did he. It's a lot of food for a nearly empty pantry, he said. I'm not working from a nearly empty pantry anymore, she said. And yes, it is. It's supposed to be. He straightened up, took a step back. The moment passed, easy and without remark, the way she'd wanted it to. But it had happened. And they both knew it had happened. in the way that things known can't be unknown, regardless of how carefully you continue, as if they weren't. The days between the invitations and the dinner moved fast in the particular way of days, with too much in them. Bread had to be baked in stages and stored. The beans went on to soak the day before. Gideon brought in extra wood without being asked. Silas, who had moved from bedroom to chair to moving carefully around the house under his own power, appeared in the kitchen doorway the morning of the dinner and looked at the organized preparation and said nothing for a long moment. Ellen used to do a big Christmas dinner, he said. The house would smell like this. Ellen, E.R. Sept. 1879. She sounds like she knew what she was doing, Maeve said. She did. He was quiet. She'd have liked you, he said finally, not looking at her, addressing it toward the middle distance, somewhere to her right. The way you came in here and just started. It was the closest thing to a compliment he'd given her without adding a complaint to it, and she knew better than to make too much of it. Go sit by the fire, she said. You need to look healthy tonight, not thin and gray. I've never been gray. You were gray for about a week in January. He made a dismissive sound and went to sit by the fire, and she heard him settle into his chair. Most of its windows were dark, and there was in that settling sound that hadn't been in this house, since jumped into it something that sounded, imprecisely but truly, like the possibility of being all right. She went back to the bread. The table was set for 30. Outside, the afternoon had gone cold and hard and clear, the sky, the deep blue of late winter, pressing itself out down toward a horizon that had finally, in the last week, begun to hold the faintest suggestion of something less brutal ahead. Not spring, not yet, but the memory of spring, the idea that it was still possible. Inside, the kitchen breathed and moved and smelled of everything she'd coaxed out of smoked meat and dried beans and the roots of things that had survived underground through the worst of the winter. Most of its windows were dark, and the house that had felt like giving up 3 weeks ago felt for the first time like something that intended to stay. She did not let herself feel triumph about this, because triumph was for people who'd finished something, and she understood, standing in the middle of the heat and the noise of her own preparation, that this dinner was not a finish. It was a declaration. And outside, somewhere far down the road, the first wagon lantern of the evening was beginning to appear through the winter dark, coming toward the light. The first wagon arrived 40 minutes before Maeve had planned for anyone to arrive, which told her everything she needed to know about how curious the neighboring ranchers actually were, regardless of what their faces would show when they came through the door. It was the Voss family, Cal Voss, his wife Dorothy, and their 2 grown sons, and they came in stomping snow off their boots with the particular energy of people who told themselves they were doing a favor and were starting to suspect they'd come for other reasons entirely. Cal Voss was a broad, weathered man in his late 50s who shook hands like he was testing the structural integrity of everything he touched. Dorothy Voss brought a wrapped pan of something she set on the kitchen table without being asked, because she was the kind of woman who understood that you never arrived at someone's trouble empty-handed. Silas, Cal Voss said, when he found the older man sitting upright in his chair near the fireplace looking considerably more alive than rumor had suggested. The surprise on his face was genuine, and he didn't try to hide it. You look better than I heard. I look better than I was, Silas said. Sit down, Cal. Maeve watched this exchange from the kitchen doorway and then went back to the stove. There were 11 things happening simultaneously, and she was tracking all of them with the split attention she'd developed over years of cooking for large groups. The soup at a temperature that held without overcooking, the pork sliced and resting, the bread coming out in rotation, the beans seasoned and staying warm on the back burner. She'd arranged the kitchen so that every stage of service had a clear path and nothing was in the way of anything else. Because in a kitchen that size serving 30 people, chaos wasn't a possibility, it was a guarantee, and the only thing you could do about it was reduce its range. Gideon was at the door, greeting arrivals. She could hear his voice lower than his father's, steadier in public settings, the voice of a man who'd learned that ease was itself a kind of information you gave people. He was good at this in a way she hadn't entirely expected. He made people feel that their coming had been the right choice without making them feel obligated for making it, which was a narrow channel to navigate, and he was doing it without apparent effort. The Harpers came next, then the McIntyres, then 3 families she hadn't met yet, who introduced themselves in quick succession in the entryway, while Gideon took coats. And Maeve sent one of the Voss boys, who'd been drafted without ceremony, to carry the soup pot to the sideboard she'd prepared in the main room. By the time the last wagon arrived and the house held its full count 31 people, as it turned out, because the youngest Harper had brought a friend, nobody had mentioned the noise level had risen to something that bounced off the low ceilings and the old plank floors and made the house sound, for the first time since Maeve had walked into it, like something inhabited. Silas sat in his chair by the fire and received people with the careful energy of a man who was still conserving, but wouldn't admit it. She kept an eye on him from across the room. He was holding up more than holding up, actually. There was something returning to his face in increments as the room filled, something she could only describe as recognition, the look of a man remembering what his own life had contained before it had been pared down to sickness and silence and the particular meanness of fighting alone. She was ladling soup when she first noticed the man who'd come in with the McIntyre party. She wouldn't have noticed him. Particularly, he was unremarkable in the way that some men are deliberately unremarkable, dressed plainly, speaking quietly, attaching himself to conversations at their edges rather than their centers, except that he wasn't doing what everyone else in the room was doing. Everyone else was looking at Silas, or at Gideon, or at the table, or at each other. This man was looking at the walls, at the ceiling beams, at the window placement and the floor plan, the particular appraising look of someone calculating square footage. Maeve set the ladle down very carefully. She went back to the kitchen and stayed there for 2 minutes, thinking. Couldn't confront a man she had no evidence against in the middle of a dinner she'd organized specifically to project stability. She couldn't ask Gideon about him without crossing the room in a way that would draw attention. She had to finish serving the soup, get the bread out, move the meal forward, and watch. She watched. His name, she learned through the natural sifting of dinner conversation, was Aldrich. He'd come with the McIntyre family under the loose pretense of being a surveying acquaintance of their eldest son, quiet and pleasant and ask the right questions at the right moments, the kind of questions that seemed like friendly interest and were actually gathering information. She'd known men like him before, not many, but enough. Her father had been a surveyor himself, and he'd taught her that the difference between a man surveying land legitimately and a man surveying land with other intentions was sometimes only visible in what he was measuring and why. Aldrich was measuring Red Willow. She kept that knowledge to herself and served the soup. The soup was good. She knew it was good before anyone said so. She'd tasted it enough times to know exactly what it was doing. The smoked pork lending depth to the broth, the root vegetables soft and sweet from the long simmer, the herbs present but not announcing themselves. It was the kind of soup that made people quiet in a good way, the way food can quiet a room, not by filling it with obligation, but by offering something genuine in a moment when people had been uncertain what to expect. Dorothy Voss said after her first spoon, "Where did you learn to cook like this?" "My mother," Maeve said. "She was better at it than I am." "I don't know how that's possible." Cal Voss said. From across the table, Silas, "How long have you been keeping a cook like this secret?" Silas, who was eating his soup with the focus of a man who'd been eating functionally rather than pleasurably for months and was remembering what pleasurably tasted like, looked up. "She's not a secret. She's just been here. You should have invited us sooner," Cal said. Silas said, "I'm inviting you now," and went back to his soup. It was not a gracious speech, but it was enough. Maeve watched Cal Voss's skepticisms that had come in with the cold, still riding his shoulders beginning to set down. A small change. But she'd learned to read small changes. The bread came out in 2 rounds and was gone almost immediately, which was exactly what bread was supposed to do at a table where people had come uncertain and were becoming certain. She'd made more than she'd planned for, anticipating this, and she'd planned for more than she'd announced, anticipating the anticipation. It was the kind of preparation that looked effortless from the outside and was built on 3 days of quiet calculation. She was refilling the breadbasket for the second time when she became aware of a change in the room's energy. It wasn't loud. It started as a slight shift in the conversation at the far end of the table, a lowering of voices, a leaning together of heads, and then moved toward her end with the slow, rolling inevitability of weather. She handed the breadbasket to the nearest person without looking at them and paid attention. The second man she hadn't originally noticed was talking. He'd been at the table the whole time she placed him now, seated between two of the older ranchers, introduced at some point as a cattle agent passing through the territory, someone another guest had vouched for, in the casual way of people who trust the vouching of others without examining it carefully. His name was Luther Vane. She knew that now because she'd heard it said twice in the last 3 minutes. And Luther Vane was saying, in the quiet, serious voice of a man sharing troubling information out of genuine concern, that he'd heard just recently, just in passing, from someone's enlightened Billings, from someone at the bank, who really shouldn't have said anything that the Rourke debt had already been called. The bank had already made its decision, that the land would belong to a buyer from Denver by the 1st of April. He said it the way you say something you wish weren't true. Most of its windows were dark. Maeve stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the main room and felt the cold move through her that had nothing to do with the temperature. She watched it land. Watched the faces of the older ranchers go careful and neutral, which was what faces did when they'd heard something they'd been half expecting, and were now deciding whether to believe it entirely. She watched Dorothy Voss look at her husband. She watched Cal Voss look at Silas. Silas was looking at Vane. He'd heard it. His face had gone the controlled, closed expression of a man trying to manage something he hadn't been prepared for. And the effort of it was visible because he was still recovering and didn't have his full reserves. Gideon had heard it too. He was standing near the sideboard, and she could see in the set of his jaw the specific tension of a man deciding between two equally bad options, confronting Vane directly and looking desperate, or saying nothing and looking like the story was true. Maeve set down the empty breadbasket. She walked into the main room. She didn't hurry. Hurrying would signal panic, and panic was Vane's entire objective. She moved at the pace of a woman who had something to say and wasn't in any particular rush to say it because she was confident in what it was. "Mr. Vane," she said. Vane looked at her. He had a mild, forgettable face, the kind of face that was designed to be underestimated, and she understood that he was very good at his job because of it. "I don't believe we've been properly introduced," she said. "I'm Maeve Calder. I manage the household at Red Willow." She kept her voice at the register of polite dinner conversation. "I couldn't help overhearing. You said you'd had information from someone at the bank in Billings." "Just something I heard," Vane said pleasantly. "I may have it wrong." "You do have it wrong," she said. "But let me be specific about where." She pulled a folded paper from the pocket of her apron. She'd put it there that morning without entirely knowing why, one of the habits of a woman who'd learned that the right document at the right moment was worth more than any argument. It was the most recent communication from the bank, setting out the current payment schedule and confirming the terms. She didn't unfold it dramatically. She just held it. "The bank in Billings has not called this debt. The payment schedule is current. If someone told you otherwise, they were mistaken. Or they were telling you what they'd been told to tell you, which is a different problem." The room had gone quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something is actually happening. "I'm not suggesting anything improper," Vane said. His voice was still pleasant, impressively so. "Just sharing what I heard." "I understand that," Maeve said, "and I'm sharing what I know. The difference is that what I know is documented." She held up the paper slightly, not waving it, not performing, just making it visible. Red Willow's financial situation is the Rourke family's business. But the accuracy of what's said about it at a dinner table is everybody's business. She put the paper back in her pocket. "More bread?" she said to the table at large. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Cal Voss said, "I'll take some bread," and the room exhaled, and the conversation restarted, and Vane sat with his pleasant face arranged in its pleasant arrangement and said nothing else. She went back to the kitchen. Her hands, she noticed, were entirely steady. She was slightly surprised by this, and she wasn't. This was the thing she'd learned about herself in hard situations, that the calm came not from the absence of fear, but from having something to do. Fear without a task was immobilizing. Fear with a full kitchen and 30 people depending on the next course was just fuel. Gideon appeared in the kitchen doorway 30 seconds later. "That paper," he said quietly. "From the bank, March correspondence. You've been carrying it in your apron since this morning." She began to plate the pork. You carry things that might be useful. That's just sense. He was quiet for a moment. He's still out there. Aldrich or Vane? He went still. How long have you known about Aldrich? Since the soup course. She handed him a platter, the way he was looking at the walls. Your mother used to preserve apples. Does she have a marking she used on the jars? He blinked at the shift in subject. ER. She always wrote ER and the month and year. Why? Take that platter. I'll explain later. He took it. She went back to the stove and she stood there for one moment, just one, with her eyes closed, running through what she'd assessed and what she hadn't yet, the way her father had taught her to scan a survey map before putting pen to paper, making sure you hadn't missed a creek or a rise in the terrain that would change everything. She was missing something. She could feel it. Not Vane, not Aldrich, something behind them, something that Slate had constructed that she hadn't fully mapped yet. She opened her eyes and finished plating the pork. The main course settled the room, in the way that a well-made meal will, regardless of the tensions that preceded it. Something about sharing food at a common table has a gravity to it that is very difficult to argue against. And Maeve had built this meal specifically to have that gravity, not with pretension, but with the honest work of good ingredients handled without waste. The pork was tender from the slow smoke of weeks past and the long rest she'd given it. The beans had the depth of something that had been treated with patience. The roasted root vegetables were sweet and slightly charred at the edges in the way that made them taste intentional rather than functional. She watched the room eat. She watched Cal Voss's skepticism become something more complicated, not gone, but alongside something else now, some reconnection with the specific people across the table from him that the rumor distance of recent months had eroded. She watched the younger ranchers relax into conversation that had nothing to do with debt or land speculators, cattle prices, spring breeding plans, the road condition north of the Harpers spread. Normal things. The normal things that neighbors talked about when they were still neighbors. Silas sat at the head of his own table for the first time in longer than Maeve knew, and he ate, and he talked, and he was not performing recovery, he was actually recovering, visibly, in real time, in the company of people who'd known him for decades. That was something no broth she'd made could have done on its own. She stayed mostly in the kitchen. She'd found that was the right position for her present, enough to manage, absent enough that the room belonged to the family. She was the mechanism. The Rourkes were the reason. Most of its windows were dark. It was during the lull between the main course and dessert that Gideon found a moment to come to the kitchen, and she told him about what she'd understood of Aldrich. He's assessing the property, she said, quietly. He came in through the McIntyres without announcing himself, which means the McIntyre boy doesn't know what he's actually doing. He's Slate's man. Gideon's expression went through several things. We can have him removed. If you remove him, Slate knows we spotted his assessment. That's information we'd be giving them that we don't have to give. She was cutting dessert, a simple preparation, honey-sweetened cornmeal cake, not elaborate but warm and unexpected at the end of a winter meal. Let him look. What does he see? He sees a house full of neighbors. He sees Silas Rourke sitting at the head of his table. He sees a functioning household with food on it. She looked at Gideon, let him report that back to Denver. Gideon thought about it. You want Slate to hear that the dinner went well. I want Slate to hear that this ranch has 30 neighbors who just ate at its table. I want him to understand that the isolation he's been building around this place didn't hold. She put the cake on the board to be carried out. That's worth more than anything we could say to a banker. Gideon was quiet. You think about this the way my father thinks about cattle. It's a system. Not just one animal, but the whole herd, how they move, what they need, where the weak spots are. He looked at her in the way she'd been carefully not meeting for 2 weeks. Where did you learn that? My father surveyed land for 20 years. The first thing he taught me was that you have to understand what something actually is before you can understand what's being done to it. She handed him the cake board. Take that out. He took it. At the door he stopped. She looked at him. Thank you, he said. Not just for tonight. She held his gaze for one moment. Don't thank me yet, she said. Take out the cake. He went. The cake was received with the surprise pleasure of something unexpected. People had been full, had believed the meal complete. Most of its windows were dark, and then there was warmth and sweetness at the end of a hard winter evening, and it caught them slightly off guard in a way that opened something. Maeve heard the change in the room from the kitchen, a loosening, a warming. People remembering something about the place they were sitting. She was cleaning the first round of dishes when she heard Dorothy Voss's voice, different from its dinner register, lower and more direct. Silas, I need to say something, and I want you to hear it. Maeve went still. We heard the rumors, Dorothy said. Most of us believed more of them than we should have. That's on us, not you. But you didn't ask for help, and we didn't offer it. And that's we should have ridden out here months ago. You didn't know, Silas said. His voice was neutral. The neutrality cost him. We should have checked whether we knew. Pause. What's done is done, Silas said, which from him, Maeve had come to understand, was as close to acceptance as he was built to offer. Cal wants to talk to you about the cattle buyers from Cheyenne, Dorothy said. He's been using a different agent, and the prices have been better. He should have told you this 2 years ago. He's going to tell you now. There was a longer pause. All right, Silas said. In the kitchen, Maeve set a clean pot on the stack she'd been building and did not smile exactly. But something in her settled. It was near 9 o'clock when the first family said their goodnights. The departure had the gradual quality of an evening that had been better than expected, people leaving slowly, because leaving meant the thing was over, staying a few minutes more because the thing was still good. Coats were retrieved. Children who'd fallen asleep in back rooms were carried out. Horses were unhitched and rehitched in the cold outside, and the lanterns bobbed away into the dark one by one, like diminishing stars. Luther Vane left in the middle of the general departure, slipping out in the movement of other people, which was exactly how she'd expected him to leave. She watched him go. He would report back. She knew what he'd report, and she knew it was not the report Slade had sent him for. Aldrich left with the McIntyre family, and as he passed through the door, he caught her eye for one fraction of a second, just that, a fraction, and she held his gaze without expression, and he went out, and that was that. By the time the last wagon had pulled away, the house held the specific quiet of a place that had been full and was now empty, not empty like before, not the empty of abandonment, but the empty of a room where something had recently happened, and the air still held the shape of it. Gideon brought in the last of the dishes that had migrated to the main room. Silas was still in his chair, which he'd held all evening with the determination of a man who'd made a decision about where he was going to be and wasn't moving from it, regardless of what it cost him. He looked exhausted in a way that was different from the exhaustion of sickness, full and tired rather than depleted and empty. Go to bed, Gideon told him. I'm not an invalid. You held court in that chair for 4 hours. Go to bed. Silas looked like he intended to argue, and then looked at his son, really looked at him, for a sustained moment and said, help me up. Gideon helped him up. He was careful about it, more careful than necessary. The way you're careful with something you've realized has more fragility than you'd previously acknowledged. Silas didn't acknowledge the care, and Gideon didn't make anything of it, and they moved together across the room to the hallway without another word. Maeve washed dishes. She washed them all because someone had to, and because the work gave her hands something to do, while her mind did the other thing, the surveying thing, the mapping thing, going back over the evening and finding the edges of it, the places where the terrain hadn't been what she'd expected. Vane had been good. She'd been lucky with the bank letter, lucky that she'd put it in her pocket that morning, lucky that she'd been near enough to hear him. Lucky that the moment had presented itself clearly enough for her to walk into it without hesitation. But luck wasn't a strategy. Vane had come because Slate had sent him, which meant Slate had known about the dinner, which meant someone had passed that information from the territory to Denver in the 12 days since Gideon had issued the invitations. That was a shorter distance than it should have been. And Aldrich had been there to look at the property, not to evaluate the debt, which Slate presumably already knew to the dollar, but to look at the physical land itself. The house, the outbuildings, the water situation, maybe. The water situation. She let that thought sit in the corner of her mind without looking at it directly, the way you let something come into focus at the edges of your vision rather than trying to force it to the center. The creek that crossed the back of Red Willow property. She'd seen it frozen in January, a silver line cutting through the white of the back pasture. Yep. Constant, even in the coldest month. She'd noticed it the way she noticed everything, cataloged it, filed it. Her father's daughter, even 20 years after his death. A creek that ran year-round was a resource her father had told her was worth more in Western Territory than most things on the surface of the land. Was water rights. In a territory where water was the difference between a working ranch and a dried-out failure, were the kind of asset that a man like Slate would understand before anyone else did. What did Slate actually want with Red Willow? She scrubbed a pot and thought about it. Everyone, the bankers, the neighboring ranchers, probably Gideon himself before he'd returned, had framed the ranch as a failing cattle operation, debt problem, a management problem, something that had lost its value through misfortune and age and a widower's slow decline. But Slate had been circling it for 3 years. 3 years was not how long you circled something with no value. 3 years was how long you circled something with a value you were trying to make sure nobody else identified before you could acquire it cheaply. She rinsed the pot, a year-round creek, water rights under territorial law, and a wealthy Denver man who'd spent 3 years depressing the apparent value of a piece of land. She was missing something in the legal specifics. Her father had surveyed land, but she'd been a child when he'd worked, and her understanding of territorial water law was general rather than precise. She needed documentation she didn't have. She needed someone who understood what she was beginning to think she was seeing. She set the clean pot on the stack. Gideon came back into the kitchen while she was wiping down the stove. He looked at the clean dishes and then at her. "You didn't have to do all of this tonight. It's easier to cook in a clean kitchen," she said. "Maeve." She turned around. He was leaning against the doorframe in the particular posture of a man who's been on his feet for 5 hours and is only now noticing it. His face had the open quality that fatigue sometimes brings the guards down. The performing self gone, just the actual person left standing in the kitchen at the end of a hard night. "Vane," he said, "you stopped him. For tonight. That's what I mean." He looked at her steadily. "I had the same thought when he started talking. I almost said something. I probably would have said the wrong thing. You might have been fine. I would have sounded defensive. You sounded like you'd corrected a bookkeeping error." He shook his head slightly. "How do you do that?" "I've been managing difficult situations in other people's houses since I was 19, she said. "You learn to read the room before you open your mouth." She folded the cloth she'd been wiping with, and I was scared. I just wasn't going to let it show. Something shifted in his face. The admission seemed to matter to him in a way she hadn't anticipated, not the fear itself, but the honesty of it, the acknowledgement that she'd been scared and had done it anyway. "Tonight worked," he said. "Yes," she said. "Tonight worked. But Slate will know that by morning." She looked at him directly. "Gideon, I need to ask you something about the creek." He frowned. "The South Creek? Is there another?" "No." "How long has it run year-round?" "Far as I know, always." "It's fed from the mountains. It's run through every drought I remember." He looked uncertain about where she was going. "Why? Have the water rights ever been formally assessed? Under territorial law?" The uncertainty deepened. "Not that I know of. It's just the creek. It's always been there." "Has Slate ever mentioned it? In any of the offers he made to your father?" Gideon thought about it. Really thought, not just answering quickly. She'd noticed that about the weeks when he took a question seriously, he actually stopped and worked it rather than producing a ready answer. "No," he said slowly. "He never mentioned the creek. A man trying to buy a ranch mentions everything wrong with it. He mentions the debt, the declining cattle numbers, the reputation problems he's helped create. He doesn't mention a year-round water source." She looked at Gideon and let him follow it to where she was pointing. He followed it. She watched the moment it arrived on his face. "He already knows its value," Gideon said. "And he's never mentioned it," she said. "Because mentioning it would tell your father to have it assessed." The kitchen went very quiet. Outside, the wind had picked up again, not the blizzard violence of January, but the ordinary cold complaint of a Montana February night, something that would be unpleasant but navigable. Through the window over the sink, the back pasture was a pale darkness, and somewhere under the snow out there, moving the way it had always moved, the creek ran. "We need a territorial surveyor," Maeve said. "Someone with no connection to Slate." Gideon nodded slowly. He was still processing, but she could see him moving through it with the methodical quality she'd come to trust in him over the weeks. He wasn't fast. In a crisis she was faster, which she'd learned to use rather than be frustrated by, but he was thorough when he got there. "I know a man," he said, "in Helena. Worked with my father years ago. He's independent. Can you reach him without going through anyone Slate knows? Can ride to Helena myself. How long? 3 days there and back if the roads are passable. She thought about it. 3 days wasn't nothing. But it wasn't too long if what she suspected was accurate. Before you go, sit with your father. Tell him about the creek. Tell him what I think we're looking at. She met his eyes. He needs to understand this. It's his ranch. He has to be part of the decision. He'll want to know how you figured it out. Tell him his wife's apple preserves helped, she said. She could see the question forming on his face, and she shook her head slightly. I'll explain it properly. Not tonight. Tonight you both need sleep. He accepted that. He straightened up from the doorframe, and for a moment they were standing in the kitchen at the end of the longest evening of the winter, and the house was quiet around them. And the thing that had been true for 2 weeks, and neither of them had named, was in the room with them again. More present than before, the way things become more present when they've been acknowledged quietly and then set carefully aside. He said good night. He said it in the voice of a man who had several other things he was not saying, which was she'd come to understand his way of saying them. She heard him go down the hall to his room. She stood in the kitchen for a while after that, not cleaning anything, not preparing anything, just standing in the middle of the room that had been warm and loud and full of 30 people 5 hours ago, and was now hers alone. The fire had gone to comfortable coals. The bread smell was still in the walls. A stack of clean dishes stood where she'd built it. She thought us out slept in Denver, asleep in whatever house he kept there, confident in a plan 3 years in the making. She thought about the creek running somewhere under the February snow, unassessed, its value sitting in the dark like something that had been buried so long, even the people who owned it had forgotten to wonder what it was. Her father had told her once that the most valuable things in a survey were always the things people walked past every day without looking at. Not because they were hidden, because they were so constant, so ordinary, so thoroughly present that they'd become invisible. What you stop seeing is what someone else is counting on stealing. She went to bed. In her small room off the kitchen, she lay on the narrow cot with the cookbook on her chest the way other people might hold something for comfort, and she stared at the ceiling, and she let herself be as uncertain as she actually was, which was considerably more uncertain than she would have let anyone in that room see. She didn't know if the surveyor could be reached. She didn't know if the water rights assessment would show what she believed it would show. She didn't know what Slate's next move would be when he heard Vane's report, and she'd learned enough about the man by now to understand that he would have another move, and it would be faster and less patient than the one before. She knew that tonight had worked. She knew it the way she knew when a meal was right, not from the compliments after, but from the texture of the room during. People had come skeptical and left something else, and that something else was not gratitude or pity. It was the reorientation of people who'd almost given up on something and had been given reason not to. That was real. That had happened. Whatever came next, that was a foundation. She pulled the blanket tighter. She listened to the wind against the walls, and the house holding against it. Most of its windows were dark in the silence of 2 men asleep somewhere down the hall, who'd spent an evening remembering what they were to each other and to this place, and it was not a comfortable silence exactly. It was a working silence, the silence of things unresolved but no longer abandoned, and it was enough. It was enough for tonight. Outside, the February dark pressed down on Red Willow, and the creek moved somewhere beneath the snow, constant and unaccounted for, carrying its invisible value through the cold and the dark and the long distance between what things appeared to be and what they actually were. The letter from the bank arrived on a Tuesday, 4 days after the dinner. Maeve was in the kitchen when Gideon brought it in. She knew from the way he walked, not the normal morning walk of a man coming in from the cold, but the shorter, tighter movement of someone, carrying something they haven't decided how to hold yet, that whatever was in the envelope was not ordinary correspondence. He set it on the table without opening it. She looked at it, then at him. Bank of Billings, he said. Official seal. She wiped her hands on her apron and sat down across from him. Open it. He opened it. He read it once, quickly, and she watched his face do the thing she'd seen it do only twice before go completely still in the way of a man whose mind is working so fast that everything else has stopped. Then he set it flat on the table and slid it toward her. The letter was 2 paragraphs. The language was formal and without malice, which was almost worse than if it had been angry. It said that given the current status of the outstanding debt and recent assessments of the property's projected value, the bank was exercising its right under the terms of the original loan agreement to accelerate the repayment schedule. The full outstanding balance was now due in 6 weeks, rather than the 18 months originally remaining. 6 weeks. Maeve read it twice. She folded it along its original crease and set it back on the table. The number sat between them like something with weight. Recent assessments of the property's projected value, Gideon said. His voice was flat. Aldrich, yes, he was here 4 days ago. They've already filed something with the bank. He pushed back from the table and stood up, not going anywhere, just needing to not be sitting down. Slate moved the moment the dinner was over. He knew we'd consolidated support from the neighbors, and he accelerated everything before we could use it. Yes, she said again. 6 weeks. He said it like he was testing whether the number was real. We don't 6 weeks of full payment. We don't have 6 weeks of half payment. He stopped. He turned toward the window. Outside, the February morning was gray and still. I need to tell my father. I know. He's going to. Gideon stopped again. She understood what he wasn't finishing. Silas had fought for 3 years alone. He'd held on through the supplier credit collapse, through the reputation damage, through the isolation and the sickness and the pride that wouldn't let him ask his son to come home. He'd held on with the particular stubbornness of a man who'd decided the ranch was worth whatever it cost him. And now the number was 6 weeks, and there was no obvious way through it. I'll make breakfast first, Maeve said. Gideon turned from the window. How can you think about breakfast right now? Because your father needs to hear this with food in him rather than without, she said, already moving to the stove. And because I need 10 minutes to think, and my hands need something to do while I do it. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she didn't have time to interpret, and then he sat back down, which meant he was going to let her have the 10 minutes, which meant he trusted her enough to wait, and she registered that without stopping what she was doing. She made eggs and salt pork, and the last of the cornbread from 2 days ago warmed in the pan. She made coffee. She worked quickly and without waste, the way she always worked when the situation was serious. And she used the 10 minutes the way she'd said she would. Weeks. Full balance. A bank that had just received an assessment from a man working for Slate, which meant the bank, or at least someone in it, was part of the machinery. Not necessarily corrupt, maybe not even knowing they were being used, but operating on information they'd been given by a source with an interest in a specific outcome. The water rights. She hadn't stopped thinking about the creek since the night of the dinner. She'd been waiting for Gideon's return from Helena. He was supposed to leave in 2 days, reach the independent surveyor by Friday, but 6 weeks changed the timeline of everything. The surveyor needed to move faster than planned. And there was something else, something she'd been carrying since she'd stood in that root cellar, looking at the jars with Ellen Rourke's handwriting on the labels, a thought she hadn't fully articulated yet, because she didn't have all the parts of it. Her father had surveyed this territory. Not Red Willow specifically, but the region. She'd been a child, but she remembered him talking about water rights assessments in the months before he died, remembered the specific way he described certain creeks in the Montana territory as undervalued under current law, remembered, and this was the part she kept returning to, that he'd kept his survey records. All of them. In a series of notebooks she'd carried from house to house for 15 years because she hadn't been able to bring herself to leave them behind. The notebooks were in her canvas bag. She'd never read them in their entirety. They were her father's work, dense, with the technical notation of a surveyor's profession, figures and measurements, and legal references she'd always told herself she'd understand better when she had more time. Carried them out of sentimentality and practicality in equal measure. Her father had told her once that a survey record was like a deed, that it described what existed whether or not anyone was paying attention to it. She had never imagined they might matter in this way. She served breakfast. Telling Silas took less time than she'd expected, because Silas, it turned out, had been expecting something like it. Not the exact shape, not the 6 weeks, not the acceleration, but something. He sat at the table, and he read the letter with the reading glasses he'd recently admitted to needing, and when he was done, he set it down and was quiet for a moment, and then said, "Slate." Yes, Gideon said. Aldrich was his. We believe so. Silas took a long breath. He was looking at the letter rather than at either of them, and Maeve watched him the way she'd learned, to watch him reading the small signals rather than the large ones, the set of his shoulders, the movement of his jaw. He was absorbing something he'd been bracing for, without knowing exactly what form it would take. That was different from being broken by it. 6 weeks is not enough time, he said. No, Gideon agreed. We can challenge the acceleration. On the terms of the original agreement, Silas looked up. Your grandfather's lawyer and Helena Mercer. He's old, but he's sharp. That buys time, Gideon said. But it doesn't solve the underlying problem. Silas looked at him. What's the underlying problem? Slate doesn't want us to pay the debt, Gideon said. He wants the land. The acceleration is designed to make sure we can't pay it. He glanced at Maeve. Tell him. She'd been waiting for this moment. She'd thought about how to say it not dramatically, not with build-up, because Silas didn't respond well to drama, and the information itself was dramatic enough. She said it plainly, the creek. The year-round water source. Territorial water rights law. The fact that Slate had circled this property for 3 years and had never, in any of his offers or his efforts to depress its value, mentioned the creek. Question that followed from that. Silas was quiet for a long time when she finished. Long enough that Gideon shifted in his chair. Long enough that Maeve wondered if she'd misjudged something, if there was a piece of information she didn't have that would make this theory fall apart. My wife used to say the creek was the best thing on the property, Silas said. He said it quietly, to the table. I thought she just liked the sound of it. She'd walk out there in the evenings. He stopped. I never had it assessed. Why not? Gideon asked. Because it was just the creek. It's been there since before my father settled this land. It never occurred to me to. He stopped again. He picked up his coffee cup and set it down without drinking from it. I've been an idiot. You didn't know what you had, Maeve said. That's not the same thing. I've lived on this land for 30 years. Slate has spent 3 years and considerable money ensuring that nobody looked at what this land actually contains, she said. He's very good at what he does. You not knowing is part of how he does it. Silas looked at her. He had the specific expression he wore when she said something that landed somewhere he hadn't expected, not quite surprise, because surprise implied he'd underestimated her, and she thought he'd stopped underestimating her sometime around the 10th day, but something adjacent to it, a recalibration. You've been thinking about this since before the dinner, he said. Since the root cellar, she said. When I found your wife's preserves, he was quiet again, shorter this time. The notebook, she said. My father's survey records. He worked this territory. I don't know if Red Willow is in them. I've never read them thoroughly. But if he assessed any of the water sources in this region, there may be documentation of existing value that predates whatever Slate's assessment will claim. Both men looked at her. Your father surveyed Montana territory? Gideon said. For 20 years. He died when I was 17. I've carried his record since. She looked at Silas. I need to read them tonight. If there's anything relevant, it changes what we bring to a legal challenge. Silas said, Get them. She got them. The notebooks were 5 in total, cloth-covered, densely written in her father's precise hand, organized by region and year. She brought them to the kitchen table after supper that evening and started reading, and Gideon sat across from her with the bank letter and his father's old deed documentation spread between them, and cross-referencing what she read against what they had. And Silas sat in his chair nearby with a lamp because he'd refused to be sent to bed, and she hadn't pushed it. It was slow work. Her father's notation system was logical, but required learning abbreviations that only made sense once she'd seen them used enough times. Measurement references that meant nothing without their context. She read through 2 notebooks without finding anything directly relevant, and the third was surveys from a different region entirely, and she was halfway through the 4th when she found it. A creek assessment from the summer of 1871. Red Willow Creek named specifically, which meant her father had surveyed the property or the land adjacent to it. The assessment was detailed in the way her father did all his work, thorough to the point that sometimes she'd thought it was excessive, unable to pass a water source without measuring it, unable to note a datum without noting the 3 adjacent ones as confirmation. Red Willow Creek ran year-round. Her father had assessed it in a dry July, and it was still running. He'd measured the volume. He'd noted the mountain source. He'd written, in his careful notation, a specific designation that Maeve stared at for a moment before she understood what it was. She knew the term. Her father had used it during her childhood in conversations she'd absorbed without realizing she was absorbing them, the designation for a water source that met the territorial requirements for senior water rights, which meant rights established before those of any subsequent claimants, rights that were protected under territorial law in a way that regular property rights were not, rights that had a separate and accessible value that did not depend on the fluctuating worth of the land itself. She read the entry 3 times to be sure. Gideon, she said. He looked up. She turned the notebook toward him and pointed to the notation. He read it. She watched him read it, watched him go through the same process. She had the slow recognition, the understanding of what it meant, the further understanding of what it meant for Slate's position. Your father assessed this in 1871, he said, 15 years ago, before the current territorial law established the formal rights framework. She leaned forward, which means this isn't a new claim. It's a documented prior assessment that predates any challenge Slate could file. Can he challenge the notebooks? Claim they're not official? My father was a licensed territorial surveyor. His records were filed with the territorial office copies of them. These are his personal copies, but they correspond to official records. The official records still exist. We'd need to verify that. Yes. She looked at him steadily. That's why you're writing to Helena. He looked at the notebook, then at her. Then, slowly, he nodded. Silas had been listening. He said from his chair, if the official records exist and match what's in that notebook, we have a documented prior assessment of senior water rights on this property. Yes, Maeve said, and Slate knows this, Silas said. Not a question. He must. A man who spent 3 years researching this property before moving on it would have found your father's old deed records, the property history. He would have gone looking for anything that affected value. She closed the notebook carefully. He found the water rights assessment, and he chose not to tell you. Every offer he made to you was based on a value he'd deliberately suppressed. Kitchen was quiet. He was stealing it, Silas said. The words came out flat and certain, the way Silas said things when he'd finished processing them and arrived at their core. He was trying to, she said. Silas was quiet for another moment. Then he said, in a voice that was different from the voice he'd been using, since January, not stronger exactly, but more like itself, more like the man who'd built and held this ranch for 3 decades before exhaustion and isolation had worn it toward something else. Get me Mercer's address. Gideon is going to Helena. Gideon left before light the next morning. He stopped in the kitchen doorway before he went coat on, saddlebags over his shoulder, and looked at her in the way he'd been looking at her lately, the way that had too much in it to be simple. I'll be back in 3 days, he said. I know. Don't let him overdo it while I'm gone. I'll do my best. He doesn't listen to me better than he listens to you. Corner of Gideon's mouth moved. He listens to you more than he listens to me. That's because I don't argue with him about fence lines. He looked at her for 1 moment longer than was strictly necessary for saying goodbye. And then he said, Maeve. And then he stopped. And she knew what was in the stop. And she also knew this was not the time for it. Go, she said quietly. Come back with what we need. He went. She stood in the kitchen after the sound of the horse had faded, and she let herself feel how much was riding. On the next 3 days, the official records, the surveyor, Mercer the old lawyer, and how much of it was outside her control, which was the particular difficulty of having spent 2 months in a crisis that she'd been able to act upon and now arriving at the part where someone else had to act while she waited. She was not good at waiting, but she was practiced at it. She managed Silas with the careful attention of someone who understood that he would push himself further than he should if she didn't create structures that made the right thing the easier thing. She made sure his meals were substantial and timed so that he'd eaten before any conversation that might exhaust him. She gave him small tasks, mending harness, leather at the kitchen table, going through the ranch's to find documentation that might support their legal position that kept his mind occupied with the physical cost of outdoor work. He found, on the second day of Gideon's absence, 2 things of relevance. One was an old letter from the Territorial Land Office, acknowledging receipt of a survey record dated 1871, filed by a surveyor whose last name was Calder. He brought it to her without comment and set it on the kitchen table while she was making bread. She looked at it. She recognized the territorial seal, recognized the reference number that corresponded to the notation in her father's notebook. My father's official record was received and filed, she said. Yes. Silas sat down, which means it exists in the territorial archive. She looked at him. He was looking at the letter. You knew my father? She asked. Not personally, I knew of him. He was well regarded in this territory. He paused. I didn't make the connection when you arrived. I should have. Calder isn't an uncommon name, no. But a female cook carrying her father's survey notebooks is a specific thing. He looked up at her then. He would have been proud of you, using them the way you have. She didn't know what to do with that, so she did what she usually did with things she didn't know how to hold. She put them somewhere safe, and kept working. This letter goes to Helena with the notebooks. When Gideon returns, she said. Yes. Silas folded it carefully and set it aside. Maze. When this is over, he stopped, started again. I'm not good at saying things. Ellen always said I was constitutionally opposed to the direct statement. She waited. You came here to do a job, he said. A temporary job. And you've done considerably more than that. He looked at the table. I want you to know that I'm aware of it. What you've done here. You'd have gotten there, she said. I'd have died on the kitchen floor, he said, with the blunt accuracy that was his particular form of honesty. That's where I was. He looked at her. Whatever happens with the bank and the water rights and all of it, you gave us a fighting chance we didn't have before you walked in that door. I want to say that plainly, since apparently I'm capable of the direct statement when I put my mind to it. She looked at him for a moment. Thank you, Silas. He nodded once. He picked up the harness he'd been mending. Don't thank me. Make something for supper. She made something for supper. The second thing of relevance that Silas found was more troubling than the first. It was in the ranch's financial records, in a ledger he'd kept in the years when the operation was running properly, a series of entries. When he laid them out for her, on the kitchen table that evening, showed the systematic pattern of what had been done to Red Willow's credit over the previous 3 years with a clarity that hadn't been visible when the events were happening one at a time. The supplier credit problem in the fall of '83. The bank credit reduction in the spring of '84. Cattle buyer who'd pulled out of a standing agreement in the summer of '84 with no explanation. A second buyer in the fall of '84 who'd offered prices so low that selling had meant a loss rather than a margin. Silas had thought, each time, that it was circumstance bad luck, a difficult market, the ordinary attrition of a ranch dealing with one hard year after another. Looking at it in sequence, laid out on the table, it was something else entirely. He moved on the supplier first, Maeve said, tracing the sequence with one finger, because credit was the easiest leverage point. Once the supplier credit was gone, you were paying higher costs for everything, which compressed your margins on the cattle. Then he moved on the buyers, not directly, probably, just made it known in the right circles that Red Willow was a troubled operation. That credit was questionable. Buyers started offering lower prices to account for the perceived risk, and the bank cut the credit line because the operation looked less viable, Silas said, which made it actually less viable, which justified the next cut. She sat back. He didn't attack the ranch. He attacked the reputation of the ranch, which attacked the finances of the ranch, which attacked the actual operation. It's like poisoning the water supply rather than fighting the person who drinks from it. Silas was quiet. She could see him processing it, not the individual pieces, which he'd lived through and known were bad, but the architecture of it, the deliberate design that had been invisible while it was being constructed. 3 years, he said, at least. He's been planning this since before he first made an offer. The first offer was probably the point when he decided the plan was working well enough, that you'd eventually sell. Not desperation on his part, confidence. She looked at the ledger. This is evidence, Silas. The pattern of it is evidence. A lawyer like Mercer, if he's as sharp as you say, will see this and know what to do with it. Can we prove Slate was behind the individual events? Maybe not everyone. But the pattern itself, the timing, the sequence, the fact that each event benefited exactly one person, that tells a story that's hard to explain any other way. She closed the ledger. We document it. Every entry, every date, every corresponding loss. We bring it to Mercer alongside the water rights evidence. You think the water rights change the bank's position. I think when the bank understands that the property they hold a mortgage on is worth considerably more than Slate's recent assessment claimed, and that the assessment was provided by a man with a financial interest in a specific outcome, they're going to have a problem with how they've been used. She met his eyes. They may not be our enemies, Silas. They may just be people who've been given wrong information. He considered that, and if they are our enemies, then we have a lawyer and a documented prior water rights assessment and a 16-year-old official record from the Territorial Archive, and we fight it. He looked at her for a long moment. You're not afraid of much, are you? I'm afraid of plenty, she said. I'm afraid we're wrong about the water rights. I'm afraid Mercer is too old and too slow. I'm afraid Slate has connections at the Territorial Archive and the records have been interfered with. She picked up the ledger and stacked it with the other documents. Fear is useful when it tells you what to prepare for. It's not useful when it just sits on your chest. Silas made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. She'd learned his sounds well enough by now to understand that this one was as close to it as he usually got. Ellen would have liked you, he said, for the second time. And like the first time, he wasn't looking at her when he said it. Which she'd come to understand was how Silas Rourke said the things that mattered most sideways, without eye contact, in the voice he used when he was exposing something real. You've said that before, she said. Worth saying twice, he said, and went back to the harness. Gideon came back on the evening of the third day, as he'd said he would. He came in with the cold still on his coat, and his face wind-burned, and the particular expression of a man who's been moving fast for 3 days and is still moving internally even though his body has stopped. She had food on the table. He ate half of it, standing at the counter, before he remembered to sit down. The records exist, he said. Mercer's clerk pulled them the same afternoon I arrived. Your father's survey record, the official filing, the territorial designation, all of it intact. Something went out of Maeve's chest that she hadn't entirely known was there. Mercer reviewed everything, the records, the notebooks, the bank letter, the ledger you put together. Gideon continued, looking at Silas, who'd come to the kitchen when he heard the horse. He says, the water rights designation, combined with the prior assessment record, establishes a senior water rights claim that was never properly incorporated into the original property assessment when Dad took the mortgage. Meaning the bank's mortgage security was never properly valued, Silas said. Meaning the bank approved a loan against a property value that was calculated without accounting for the water rights, which Mercer says is a problem for the bank. Gideon leaned forward. He also says that if we can show the recent assessment Aldrich filed was knowingly false or materially incomplete, and the ledger pattern makes a case for that, we have grounds to formally challenge the acceleration notice. The kitchen was quiet, except for the stove. How long to file the challenge? Maeve asked. Mercer is filing it this week. He's moving fast because of the 6-week window. Gideon looked at her directly. He also said, and I want to quote this exactly because it matters, he said that the prior survey record is the most significant piece of evidence he's seen in a water rights case in 20 years of territorial law. He said whoever thought to look for it saved this property. She didn't say anything to that. He means you, Gideon said. I know who he means, she said. Eat the rest of that. He ate the rest of it. But the night wasn't done with them yet, because it was 2 days after Gideon's return, 4 days before Mercer's challenge was due to reach the bank, that Slate made his final move. It came not through the bank and not through agents at a dinner table. It came through a rider who arrived in the yard at 7 in the morning, with a sealed letter addressed to Silas Rourke, personal, and who waited in the cold for a response. Maeve brought the letter to Silas. She didn't read it. She hadn't been asked to, and it wasn't her place. She waited in the kitchen while he read it, and when he came out, he handed it to Gideon without a word. Gideon read it. His face went through the stillness she'd learned to interpret as his most serious register. He handed it to her. She read it. Slate had written it himself. The handwriting was controlled, the tone was measured, and the content was a final offer generous on its surface, specific in a way that was clearly designed to look like reason. He was offering to purchase Red Willow at a price that would cover the outstanding mortgage debt and leave the Rourke family a sum he described as fair compensation for 30 years of labor. He expressed in careful language that he understood the difficulty of the situation and wished them no hardship. He gave them 10 days to respond. He noted at the end that if they chose not to respond, he would allow the bank's process to proceed. He didn't mention the creek. He didn't mention water rights. He didn't mention any of the things Mercer was now building a legal challenge upon. He had written a settlement offer designed to look like mercy, and it would cover the debt. Technically, it would get them out from under the bank. It would leave them with something, rather than nothing. Maeve folded the letter and set it on the table. The three of them sat in the kitchen, and nobody said anything for a moment, and the silence had a different weight than the silences that had come before it. This one had the weight of a decision at its center, a real decision. The kind that goes in one direction or the other and doesn't come back. It's a real offer, Silas said, not arguing for it. Naming it. It's a real offer structured to reach us before Mercer's challenge reaches the bank, Gideon said. He knows we filed. Mercer said we should assume Slate has eyes at the territorial office. He's trying to settle before the water rights assessment can change the bank's position, Maeve said. Yes, Gideon said. If we take it, we lose the ranch, Silas said. If we don't take it and Mercer's challenge fails, we lose the ranch and the settlement money, Gideon said. He looked at his father. I want to be honest about what we're weighing. Silas looked at the letter on the table. He was quiet for a long time. Maeve watched him and said nothing, because this was not her decision, and she knew it, and there was a difference between being someone who helped people understand what they had and being someone who told them what to do with it. What does Mercer say about our chances? Silas asked. Gideon had asked. He says good. He says if the territorial record is intact, and the bank reviews it, honestly, the acceleration can be challenged, and the water rights will need to be formally assessed. He says that changes the property's value significantly enough that the bank's incentive flips. It becomes better for them to have a properly valued asset on their books than to foreclose on what they've been told is a failing operation. Says good, Silas repeated. Not certain? Not certain, Gideon agreed. Nothing is certain. Silas was quiet again. Maeve looked at the letter on the table and thought about the line her mother had written in the front of the cookbook, the line she'd been reading since she was 12 years old, the line she'd read on the night she arrived here, lying on the narrow cot in her coat. You start where you are and you use what you have. Where they were was a kitchen table with a settlement offer that looked like mercy and wasn't, a legal challenge in process that looked uncertain and might not be, and 30 years of a man's life in the land outside the windows. What they had was a 16-year-old survey record, a documented pattern of deliberate damage, a lawyer filing papers in Helena, and the creek running under the February snow, constant and unassessed, carrying its invisible value through the dark. She said, Silas. He looked at her. You told me the first week that you weren't going to sell, she said. When Gideon asked you about it, you said you weren't going to sell. I said that when I thought I had options. You have options. They're harder than Slate's letter wants you to believe, but they exist. She looked at him steadily. He spent 3 years making this ranch look worthless, so he could take it cheap. The offer on that table is still cheap. It's just wrapped differently. She paused. Question is whether you believe what is in those notebooks. Whether you believe the creek is what my father said it was. Whether you believe the ranch is worth what Slate has spent 3 years trying to prevent you from knowing. Silas looked at the letter. He looked at his son. He looked at Maeve. Then he picked up the letter, folded it once more, and set it aside not in the stack of documents that mattered, but separately, away from the notebooks and the ledger and the territorial correspondence, as though it belonged to a different category of thing entirely. Write to Mercer, Silas said to Gideon. Tell him we're proceeding. Gideon nodded. And tell him to move fast, Silas said. Because I'm 61 years old, and I'm tired of being patient about this. Gideon almost smiled. The corner of it came through before he controlled it, and Maeve saw it, and something in her chest did the thing it had been doing with an increasing frequency in this kitchen, the thing she was still being careful about, the thing that was getting harder to be careful about. She got up and started clearing the table. Maeve, Silas's voice. She looked at him. When this is done, he said, one way or another. There's some things I want to say to you. I'm not saying it now because I don't believe in premature gratitude. He looked at her with the direct, unguarded look he reserved for things he meant completely. But I'm going to say it. She nodded. She didn't ask what it was. She picked up the plates and took them to the kitchen and stood at the sink and looked out the window. At the February morning, at the back pasture, at the pale line of the frozen creek at its edge. Still there. It had always been there. Running in the dark under the ice, carrying what it carried, waiting for someone to finally ask what it was worth. Mercer filed the challenge on a Thursday. By Saturday, the bank in Billings had gone quiet in the particular way that institutions go quiet when someone has handed them a problem they weren't expecting, and they need time to decide whose problem it actually is. No response, no acknowledgement, just silence, which Gideon reported back from a ride to the telegraph office in town, with the expression of a man who'd prepared himself for bad news and wasn't sure what to do with the absence of any news at all. Silence is better than a refusal, Maeve said. Silence is silence, he said. It doesn't tell us anything. It tells us they're reading it. She set a bowl in front of him. Eat. He ate. He'd stopped arguing with her about eating weeks ago, which she'd noticed and cataloged with the other things she'd noticed and cataloged, and was still being careful about. The waiting was the hardest part. Harder than the dinner, harder than the bank letter, harder than Slate's settlement offer. Because those had been moments requiring action, and action was something she understood how to give herself to. Waiting required a different discipline. It required continuing to do the ordinary things, while the extraordinary thing resolved itself in offices and archives and legal correspondence she couldn't see, making bread whilst Mercer worked, keeping the fire stoked while the Territorial Archive either had her father's records intact or didn't. Feeding Silas 3 meals a day while somewhere in Billings, a banker read a document and decided whether to be honest about what it meant. She made bread. She kept the fire stocked. She fed Silas 3 meals a day. Most of its windows were dark. She also, in the mornings before anyone else was awake, took her father's notebooks to the kitchen table and read them through completely for the first time in her life. Not for evidence she'd already found what mattered. She read them because she'd been carrying them for 15 years and had never properly read them, and because the man who'd written them had surveyed land she was now living on, and because she was 31 years old, in a house she hadn't meant to stay in, and there was something in her father's handwriting that felt, in the early morning, quiet, like a conversation she'd been postponing. He wrote the way he surveyed, precisely, without ornamentation, but with a care for accuracy that amounted to a kind of love. Every creek measured, every rise in the terrain noted, every water source described with the specific attention of a man who understood that water in the Montana Territory was not backdrop but foundation, not scenery but the thing everything else depended on. He had described Red Willow Creek in summer as abundant. He had used that word abundant in a technical survey record, which meant it had passed a threshold that most sources didn't pass, which meant he'd known 20 years, before Maeve stood in a root cellar looking at apple preserve jars, that this land had something in it that wasn't visible from the surface. She closed the notebook on the 8th morning of waiting and sat with her coffee and looked out the window at the creek line, still frozen, still visible as a pale trace across the back pasture, and thought about her father walking that ground in the summer of 1871, measuring it, noting it, understanding it with the careful tools of his profession. She thought about Silas settling that same land a decade later, building a life on it, raising a son on it, losing his wife on it, fighting for it through 3 years of calculated destruction, without knowing what was under his feet. She thought about Gideon leaving it at 22 because of one sentence, said badly, between two people who didn't know how to say the true thing clearly, and coming back at 29 to find it dying and staying. She thought about herself walking through a blizzard toward a door she'd never opened before. None of them had known what they were walking on. That was the thing that stayed with her, the way value could exist completely independent of whether anyone understood it. Creek didn't know it was valuable. The land didn't know. The water rights sat in a territorial archive for 15 years without anyone looking for them, and the ranch that contained them was slowly strangled by a man who knew their value and needed everyone else to remain ignorant of it. What you don't know about what you have is exactly what someone else will use against you. She heard Silas moving in his room. She got up and started breakfast. The response from the bank came on the 11th day. Came not as a letter, but as a person, a man named Caldwell, who arrived in a hired buggy from Billings and presented himself at the door in a wool coat that cost more than most ranch hands made in a month, with the careful manners of someone who'd been sent to manage a situation rather than resolve it. He introduced himself as a senior officer of the Bank of Billings and asked to speak with Silas Rourke. Silas was in the kitchen, Maeve was at the stove, Gideon was at the table with the ranch ledgers, which he'd been going through again with Mercer's latest correspondence alongside them. Caldwell looked at the three of them and revised whatever he'd planned to say. "Mr. Rourke," he said, addressing Silas, "I've come personally because the matter warrants it." "Sit down," Silas said. Caldwell sat. He set his leather bag on the table with the careful placement of a man who wanted it visible without being aggressive about it. Maeve kept her back to the room and tended the stove and listened to everything. "The bank has reviewed the challenge filed by your attorney, Mr. Mercer," Caldwell said, "along with the documentation attached." "And?" Silas said. "The water rights assessment your attorney submitted along with the prior server record from the Territorial Archive raises questions about the property valuation on which our mortgage was originally calculated." Caldwell spoke with the measured pace of a man who'd practiced this on the ride from Billings. "We are also reviewing certain aspects of the recent assessment that was filed with us, given information that has come to our attention about the party who commissioned it." Gideon looked up from the ledgers. "Aldrich," he said. Caldwell's expression managed to convey that he was neither confirming nor denying, while making it entirely clear. The answer was yes. Most of its windows were dark. "The bank does not take lightly the possibility that we have been supplied with materially incomplete information in the course of making a credit determination." "The possibility," Silas said. "The strong possibility," Caldwell said, and the careful language slipped just enough to show what was underneath it, which was a bank that had realized it had been used as an instrument in someone else's scheme, and was now deciding how much of that to acknowledge and to whom. Maeve turned from the stove. She set a cup of coffee in front of Caldwell without being asked. He looked at it, then at her. "The ledger documentation of the credit disruptions is also notable," he said. "The bank is not in a position to confirm the source of those disruptions. But the pattern is," he stopped. "Notable," he said again. "What does the bank intend to do?" Gideon asked. Caldwell straightened slightly. "The bank intends to commission an independent assessment of the water rights designation on this property under current territorial law. Until that assessment is complete, the acceleration notice is suspended." He paused. "The original repayment schedule will be restored pending the outcome." Kitchen was quiet. Maeve stood at the stove and looked at the window above the sink and the frozen creek line at the back of the pasture and felt something move through her that was more than relief. Relief was what you felt when a specific bad thing didn't happen. This was something else. This was the feeling of a structure holding that you'd built under pressure, not knowing if it would hold, and discovering it had. "How long for the assessment?" Silas asked. 4 to 6 weeks. "The bank will cover the cost given the circumstances." Silas was quiet for a moment. He looked at Gideon. Something's windows. Something passed between them, not spoken, not needing to be the specific exchange of two people who've been through enough together that they've developed a shared language that doesn't require words. Silas looked back at Caldwell. "Then we'll expect to hear from the assessors." "Yes, sir." Caldwell picked up his bag. He stood. He looked at Silas with an expression that was something between professional courtesy and genuine discomfort, the look of a man who was aware that his institution had been pointed in the wrong direction by someone and was not entirely comfortable with how close it had come to completing the journey. "Mr. Rourke, on behalf of the bank, I want to say that the situation has not been handled to our usual standard." Silas looked at him for a long moment. "No," he said, "it hasn't." Caldwell left. The three of them sat in the kitchen after the sound of the buggy had faded, and for the first time in the 11 days of waiting, the silence in the room was not a tense silence, but a released one, the particular quality of people who've been holding something at high tension for a long time and have just been allowed to set it down, not forever, not completely, but enough to breathe. Gideon put his face in his hands. Not dramatically, just the gesture of someone who'd been maintaining a specific expression for 11 days and no longer needed to. Silas said the creek. "Yes," Maeve said. "My wife walked there every evening," Silas said. He said it quietly, to no one in particular. "She said it was the best part of the property." He was quiet for a moment. "I thought she just liked the sound of water." Nobody said anything to that. "He was right," he said finally. "She usually was." He picked up his coffee. "Don't make a thing of it. Maeve looked at the window. I won't, she said. The independent water rights assessment took 5 weeks. 5 weeks during which March came to Montana in the grudging way that March comes to Montana, not warmly, not apologetically, but incrementally, degrees of cold becoming slightly less degrees of cold, the hard white of the fields softening at the southern edges, the creek ice thinning and beginning, in certain afternoon hours, to show the dark moving water beneath. Maeve watched the creek change the way she watched everything on the property now with the attention of someone who understood it as resource rather than scenery. She'd started planning the kitchen garden. She'd started making notes in the margins of her mother's cookbook about what would grow in the soil quality she'd assessed from the kitchen garden's edge, what would need amendment, what she wanted to try. She'd found, in the back of the cookbook, 3 pages her mother had written about cold frame gardening, and she'd read them so many times the edges of the pages had gone soft. She noticed that she was planning for seasons she hadn't been asked to stay for. She noticed that she didn't stop planning. Slate's response to the bank's suspension of the acceleration came through not directly a formal withdrawal of the settlement offer, worded in legal language that managed to convey nothing while saying it at considerable length. Mercer wrote that, in his professional opinion, Slate had calculated the legal exposure of his position once the bank began examining how Aldrich's assessment had been constructed and had decided the cost of pursuing the acquisition outweighed the potential gain. He's leaving, Gideon said, reading Mercer's letter at the kitchen table. He was never staying, Maeve said. He was extracting. Once extraction becomes too expensive, he goes somewhere else. She sat across from him. There'll be another ranch somewhere. Another man who doesn't know what he has. That's a cold way to think about it. It's an accurate way. She looked at him. He's not a villain in a story. He's a businessman who found a method that works and used it until it stopped working. The only thing that stopped it from working here was that we figured out what we had before he finished taking it. Gideon folded the letter. You figured out what we had. Your father's wife did 20 years before me, she said. She just didn't have the legal language for it. He looked at her with the look she'd stopped pretending not to see. It had been there since January. She'd cataloged it the way she cataloged everything, filed it in the category of things that needed more time before they were ready to be looked at directly. She'd been careful. She'd kept her position clear in her own mind. She was the cook. She was temporary. She was here for a job, and the job had expanded, but the nature of her being here was still fundamentally contingent on the Rourkes needing what she provided. She'd been careful, because she knew that when you were temporary in someone's house and their sonfin started looking at you in a certain way, careful was the only thing standing between you and a situation that cost you more than a job. But she'd also been planning a kitchen garden for seasons she hadn't been asked to stay for. And she'd stopped thinking of the kitchen as a kitchen she was managing and started thinking of it as the kitchen, with the particular possessive that comes from having made something so thoroughly your own that the distinction between yours and not yours had blurred beyond recovering. She knew what that meant. She just hadn't decided what to do with what it meant. The assessment results arrived on a Tuesday in late March, a Tuesday that smelled, for the first time, like something other than winter, a faint green smell underneath the cold that was less a scent than a rumor of what was coming. The assessors had come and gone over 2 days the previous week, 3 men with equipment and documentation who'd moved along the creek line with the focused attention of professionals, and had said very little to anyone in the household. The results were sent directly to Mercer and to the bank simultaneously, and Mercer sent a copy to Red Willow with a letter that opened with the words, I have been practicing territorial law for 31 years, and I have rarely had the occasion to write a letter like this one, so I will write it plainly. The water rights designation was confirmed. Senior water rights, predating all subsequent claims in the region, protected under territorial law, appurtenant to the Red Willow property, and inseparable from it under current statute. The assessed value of the water rights, added to the revised property assessment the bank's own assessors had now completed, increased the total value of the Red Willow property by an amount that Mercer described as, and here he allowed himself a single word of non-legal language, substantial. The bank's mortgage, restated against the corrected property value, put the Rourke debt at a ratio that was not only serviceable but conservative by the bank's own lending standards. Mercer's letter also noted, in its final paragraph, that he had forwarded the documentation of the credit disruption pattern to the Territorial Attorney General's office, along with a formal inquiry regarding Vernon Slate's business practices in Montana Territory, and that this inquiry was separate from and in addition to the property matter and would proceed on its own timeline. Gideon read the letter to Silas and Maeve at the kitchen table. When he finished, Silas said nothing for a full 30 seconds. Maeve counted them without meaning to. Then Silas said, "I need to go outside." He got up, put on his coat, and went out the back door. Through the kitchen window, she watched him walk across the yard steady now, fully steady, the walk of a man who'd come back from somewhere far down and made it all the way back to the fence line at the edge of the back pasture. He stood there looking at the creek, which was running now, properly running, the ice broken up in the warming days and the water visible and moving and catching the late March light. He stood there for a long time. Gideon was still at the table. He was looking at the letter but not reading it anymore. She could tell because his eyes weren't moving. He was somewhere else, or rather, he was here completely for the first time, in the specific way of people who've been living inside a crisis for so long that when it breaks, they don't immediately know how to inhabit the space it leaves. "It's over," he said. "The legal part," she said. "The ranch still needs work. The ranch has always needed work." He looked up at her. "That's not what I meant." She said nothing. "Maeve." He set the letter down. "I've been waiting for the right time to say something, and I've been talking myself out of it every time there was a reason to wait, and I've run out of reasons to wait." He looked at her directly, the way he'd learned to look at things he'd previously looked away from. "I don't want you to leave. I haven't been asked to leave. That's not what I mean either, and you know it." She did know it. She'd known for weeks what he meant when he said things adjacent to it, and she'd let the adjacency stand because it was safer than the thing itself, because the thing itself required her to stop being careful, and she'd made a career of being careful. She said, "Gideon, I walked onto this property with $2.30 and a canvas bag and no certainty about anything, and I've been here 3 months, and She stopped. Started again. "I've thought about what I want to say here more times than I'm going to admit. What did you come up with?" "Several things, some of them sensible." She looked at him. "The sensible ones all say I should be careful, that I'm the cook, that I came here temporarily, that a woman in my position who allows herself to—" She stopped again. "That it's complicated." "It is complicated," he agreed. "I'm not pretending it isn't. Your father is sitting outside right now, finding out his land is worth something he didn't know it was worth. And you're in here." "I know what's happening outside," he said. "I've known what's happening in this kitchen for 6 weeks." He wasn't moving from the chair, wasn't pressing her, wasn't doing anything except being still and direct in the way that was his particular quality when he was being completely honest. "I'm not asking you to decide anything today. I'm telling you what I want. Because I've spent 7 years not saying things I should have said, and I'm done with that." She was quiet. The back door opened, and Silas came in, bringing with him the cold and the faint green smell of the March day. He stopped when he felt the quality of the room. He looked at Gideon, then at Maeve, then at the ceiling with the expression of a man who has walked into something he'd expected to find eventually, and is deciding how to handle it with dignity. He went to the stove and poured coffee. "I'm going to speak plainly," Silas said to the coffee cup rather than to either of them, "because apparently I'm capable of it." He turned around. "Maeve Calder came here in a blizzard and kept me alive and saved this ranch and generally managed 3 months of crisis better than either of us managed it separately." He looked at Maeve. "She's also been planning a kitchen garden, which I noticed 2 weeks ago." He looked at Gideon. "And you've been mooning around this kitchen since February in a way that I'd find embarrassing if I hadn't been the same age once." He picked up his coffee. "I'm going to take this outside and look at the creek. I'll be gone 20 minutes. He looked at Maeve. "That's not an order. That's just information." He went back outside. The kitchen was quiet. Maeve looked at the door he'd closed behind him, and then she looked at Gideon, and she let herself stop being careful. Not all at once. She was built for increments, not for wholesale abandonment of caution, but enough. Enough to let what had been true in this kitchen since February be true out loud. "I've been planning the kitchen garden," she said. "I know. I didn't plan to do that. It started as just thinking about what could grow. And then I was writing it down. And then I found the cold frame notes in my mother's cookbook. And I was reading them at 4 in the morning. She looked at him. I don't do things like that for houses I'm leaving. Gideon was very still. Are you staying? He asked. I'm saying that I've already started staying, she said. In every way except officially. She paused. I'm not going to pretend I came here for this. I came here for a job and I needed the money and I walked through a blizzard because it was the practical option. I didn't come here to... She gestured at the space between them, which was everything she was not quite saying. I know why you came, he said. I know that too. He stood up from the table, not to cross to her, not to close the distance between them, just to be standing for what he was going to say. Came back to bury something. I thought the ranch was dying and I came back to watch it go. I was wrong about that. He looked at her steadily. Most of its windows were dark. I was wrong about a lot of things I thought I understood before I walked in that door and found a woman dragging my father across a kitchen floor at midnight. She almost smiled. The almost of it was close enough to be visible. I'm not perfect, she said. I've noticed. I'm difficult about things. I know that too. I have opinions about kitchens that most people find excessive. Maeve. His voice was quiet and direct. I know who you are. I've been watching who you are for 3 months in a kitchen and in a crisis and at a dinner table with 30 people and across from a bank officer and with my father when he's being impossible. He paused. I'm not asking you to be different than you are. I'm asking if you want to stay with me on this ranch. Properly, he stopped. I'm asking if you'd marry me. The word landed in the kitchen and stayed there. Maeve looked at him. She looked at the table with the letter on it, the letter that said the ranch was worth what they'd fought to prove it was worth. She looked at the window, at Silas's figure at the fence line, a man standing in the late March light looking at water that had been running under his feet for 30 years without his knowing what it was. She looked at the kitchen, the stove she'd rebuilt from cold ash, the pantry she'd inventoried and reinvented, the shelves that held what she'd put on them, the kitchen that had become, without her planning it, hers. Her mother's cookbook was on the counter where she'd left it this morning. She thought about the sentence on the first page, the one she'd read in the dark on the night she arrived, lying on the narrow cot in her coat. The sentence her mother had written, the shrimped, cramped, careful hand of someone putting down something she needed to remember. You start where you are, and you use what you have. She'd started with nothing. A blizzard and $2.30 and calloused hands and a dead woman's recipes. She'd used what she'd had, not because it was enough, but because it was what there was. And standing still was not something she knew how to do. She looked at Gideon. Yes, she said. He breathed out. It was not a romantic exhalation, it was a real one. The breath of a man who'd asked something and had not been entirely sure of the answer. She'd never trusted people who were entirely sure of the answer. The uncertainty was the honest part. He crossed the kitchen, and she let him, and he took her face in his hands the way he did everything that actually mattered, slowly, carefully, as though it was something he wanted to get right rather than just get done. When he stepped back, his hands were still cold from the morning outside. Your hands are cold, she said. The water basin's by the door, he said. I know where the water basin is. He smiled. A full smile, not the corner-of-the-mouth approximation she'd been cataloging since January, the real thing, the kind that changed the whole structure of his face. She understood now that she'd been waiting for that, and hadn't known she was waiting for it. She went to the door and opened it. Silas, she called. He turned from the fence. Come inside, she said. I'm making coffee and it's getting cold out there. He looked at her. He looked at Gideon, who had followed her to the door. He looked at the two of them in the doorway in the March morning, and something moved across his face that was not surprise, more like the recognition of something he'd been quietly expecting, the particular satisfaction of a man who'd noticed a thing developing from the beginning and had simply waited for it to arrive. He walked back across the yard. He came through the door. He took off his coat and hung it on the hook that had held his coat for 30 years. He sat down at the kitchen table in the chair he'd been sitting in for 30 years. He looked at Maeve, who was already at the stove. Well, he said. Well, she agreed. When? We haven't gotten that far, Gideon said. Get that far, Silas said. He picked up his coffee. The ranch needs stable management, and I'm not getting younger. Dad. I'm making a practical point. Maeve said. Drink your coffee, Silas. He drank his coffee. And somewhere in the arrangement of his face as he did it, the stubbornness still there, the pride still there, the particular difficulty that had always been there and would not go anywhere because it was too thoroughly himself. Somewhere in all of that was something else. Something that had been coming back slowly since the night she dragged him across a kitchen floor at midnight. Something that looked, in the morning light of a March day, that smelled finally and genuinely like the end of a very long winter, like the man he'd been before grief and isolation had pared him down to his essential stubbornness. Coffee was good. She'd learned exactly how he liked it over 3 months of mornings. Spring came to Montana the way it always does, without asking permission and without apology for how long it had taken. The fields turned from white to brown to something that was trying to become green. The creek ran freely, loudly, with the particular confidence of water that has been held still and is now released, and the sound of it became part of the morning, the way the fire had been part of the morning in January, a sound that meant the house was alive. The bank's final correspondence arrived in April, confirming the restored repayment schedule, the corrected property assessment, and the water rights designation recorded formally and officially against the Red Willow deed. Mercer sent his own note alongside it, a single line in his old lawyer's handwriting. The ranch is worth what it was always worth. Now everyone knows it. Calvas rode out the following week. He brought the Cheyenne cattle buyer contact he'd promised Silas. In February, a man named Hargreaves, who looked at the remaining herd with professional eyes and offered prices that were not generous but were fair, which was considerably better than Red Willow had been getting for 2 years under Slate's shadow. They shook hands at the kitchen table over coffee Maeve made, and the deal was the first clean deal the ranch had made in 3 years. Dorothy Voss came the week after that, without her husband, and sat in the kitchen, while Maeve worked and talked about the spring planting and the cold frame method she'd read about in her mother's cookbook, and asked questions that were half advice-seeking and half the particular conversation of women who've decided to be friends and are finding the shape of it. Maeve answered directly and without softening her opinions, which Dorothy seemed to appreciate rather than find difficult. "You're staying," Dorothy said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Maeve said. "Gideon?" "Yes." Dorothy was quiet for a moment. "Good," she said. He needed someone who wouldn't let him run away from himself. She looked at Maeve. "You're that kind of person." "I don't know what kind of person I am," Maeve said honestly. "I'm still working that out." "Aren't we all?" Dorothy said, and picked up her coffee. Kitchen garden broke ground in late April. It was the first thing Maeve had built from the beginning on Red Willow. Everything else she'd inherited in its existing state and worked with, improved, redirected. The garden was hers from the first turned shovelful. She marked out the beds the way her mother had shown her, accounting for sun angle and wind directions and soil drainage, and she built the cold frames from scrap lumber Gideon cut without being asked. He'd read the notes in her mother's cookbook while she wasn't watching, which she discovered one morning when she found the cookbook on the kitchen table with a coffee ring on the cover that wasn't hers. "You read it," she said. He didn't pretend he hadn't. "I wanted to understand the cold frame measurements. And your mother was very precise. She was exact about the kitchen and approximate about everything else," Maeve said. "I got that from her." He handed her the cookbook. She also wrote notes in the margins. Maeve opened it. She'd read her mother's recipes so many times she'd stopped seeing the marginalia, the small notations her mother had made. Besides certain recipes over the years, observations and adjustments, and occasionally, the older sections, single words that weren't about cooking at all. She looked at the page Gideon had left it open to. Beside a recipe for apple preserves her mother had written, in very small writing, in pencil that had nearly faded, "The best things keep." She stood in the kitchen holding the cookbook and looked at those 3 words for a long time. The best things keep. Her mother had put up preserves every fall for 30 years. She'd made them the same way her own mother had made them, adjusting the recipe by small degrees over time, based on the specific apples of the specific year, patient with the process in the way she was rarely patient with anything else. She'd understood, the way people who work with food over long seasons understand, that preservation is not about stopping time, it's about understanding what time does to certain things and learning to work with it rather than against it. The best things keep. She set the cookbook on the counter. She went to the root cellar. The 6 jars of Ellen Rourke's apple preserves were still where she'd left them. On the night she'd first found them wrapped carefully, set in the back corner of the wooden crate, the handwriting still clear on the labels. E.R. Sept, 1879, 7 years old. Preserved in the fall before Ellen Rourke had died, which meant she'd put them up, not knowing the winter would take her. Which meant she'd been planning forward the way you plan forward when you don't know you're at an ending one more season, one more batch of preserves, one more bet on the future. Maeve carried all 6 jars to the kitchen. She set them on the table. Gideon came in from the yard while she was standing there looking at them. He saw them and went still. "Those are my mother's," he said. "I found them in November. I was going to use one for the dinner, and then I didn't." She looked at him. I didn't know how to ask. He came to the table and picked one up. He turned it in his hands, looking at his mother's handwriting through the glass. She said, "I think she'd want them used." He was quiet for a moment. She put up preserves every fall, even the bad years. He set the jar down. She said there was no point preserving something if you were never going to open it. "She sounds like she understood the point of things," Maeve said. She did. He looked at her. "She would have liked you." "My father says so, and for once he's right." "He's usually right," Maeve said. "He just says things badly." Gideon almost laughed. The almost became the real thing she'd stopped cataloging when it was the almost versus the real, because now it happened often enough that it had become just his laugh, the ordinary sound of him in the kitchen. "Don't tell him that?" "I won't. He already knows." They opened one of the jars that evening, the 3 of them at the kitchen table, after supper spread on the last of the bread Maeve had made that morning. 7-year-old apple preserves, made by a woman who'd walked this property and loved the sound of the creek and known, in the way that people who are close to the land know things, that it held something valuable. Silas tasted it and was quiet for a long time. "She used more cinnamon than you'd expect," he said finally. "I can taste that," Maeve said. "I always liked it." He looked at the jar, kept. "They did," Maeve said. They ate the rest of it without talking. And the silence was the comfortable kind, the kind that doesn't need filling, because the room itself is full enough, the kind that you only find in a place where people have stopped performing ease and are actually feeling it. Outside, the April evening was doing what April evenings do in Montana when winter has finally lost its argument, softening, opening, the sky holding light longer than it had any right to hold it after the months of dark. The creek was audible through the walls. Maeve had started to think of its sound as part of the house, the way you stop noticing a clock, but know immediately when it stops. Silas went to bed early the way he'd been doing. Since he'd gotten his health back, not because he was tired, but because he'd reached the age where he understood that rest was not giving up but maintenance. Most of those were dark. And Maeve had helped him reach that understanding with the same patient, direct approach she'd applied to everything in this house. He stopped in the doorway. He looked at Maeve, then at Gideon, then at the kitchen, at the stove, and the clean counter and the jars of his wife's preserves, with 1 opened and 5 remaining, and the cookbook beside them with the coffee ring on the cover. He looked at it all with the expression of a man taking stock of what he has. "She started with an empty pantry," he said. He wasn't speaking to either of them specifically, more like completing a thought he'd been working on for a while. When she came here, Ellen. The house was rough then. Nothing much in it. He paused. She built it into something anyway. He looked at Maeve. "You two are going to have to repaint this kitchen." He went to bed. Gideon looked at the ceiling. "He can't say a straightforward thing," he said. "He just said several very straightforward things," Maeve said. "Repaint the kitchen? He's saying this is your house now. Yours and mine. He's saying we should make it what we want it to be." She looked at the walls, which were indeed in need of attention. "He's right. We should repaint it." Gideon looked at her. "What color?" "I haven't decided yet." She began clearing the table. "Ask me in a week." He stood up to help her. He wasn't graceful about it. He still occasionally moved through the kitchen with the slight uncertainty of a man who'd spent 7 years not living in it, but he was present in it, completely and without reserve. The waste of its wind watched him become present in everything else over the course of a Montana winter that had asked more of all of them than they'd expected to have to give. Red Willow never became the richest ranch in the territory. It didn't expand dramatically or leverage the water rights into a commercial empire. What it did was more ordinary and more durable than that. It became a working ranch again, properly, with the creek assessed and protected, and the deed correctly valued, and the neighboring relationships restored, and the cattle operation rebuilt by degrees through the spring and summer and into the fall. Calvas's cattle buyer contact became a regular arrangement. The kitchen garden produced beyond what Maeve had projected in her most optimistic planning, and she revised her mother's cold frame method based on what she learned in the first season, and the following spring she did it better. Silas recovered fully. He was not restored to who he'd been. That's not how recovery works, and anyone who tells you differently is selling something. He was restored to someone recognizably himself, which is the best that recovery usually offers. He argued about fences and weather predictions and the correct way to store dried beans, and he was wrong about the beans and right about the fence lines, and Maeve told him so directly in both cases, which he found irritating and apparently also appreciated, because he stopped arguing with her about the beans. What Maeve understood, in the year that followed the winter that had changed everything, was something she hadn't been able to articulate in January when she was dragging a stranger across a kitchen floor in a blizzard. Understood pieces, the way understanding usually comes not as a single revelation, but as the slow assembly of something from parts you'd had for a while without knowing how they fit. The piece she'd had the longest was her mother's sentence. You start where you are, and you use what you have. She'd always understood it as practical advice. Pantry management, crisis cooking, the discipline of not wishing for what you didn't have and working efficiently with what you did. But the winter had shown her a larger version of it. Silas had been starting where he was and using what he had: a stubborn will, a love for the land, a refusal to surrender, but he'd been doing it in isolation, which meant he'd been working with less than what he actually had, because what he had included people who would have helped if he'd let them. The hardest thing to use is the thing that requires you to admit you can't do it alone. Gideon had come back with nothing, but the willingness to admit he'd been wrong, which turned out to be more than enough to start with. Most people spent a lifetime not getting that far, and Maeve herself had walked into a stranger's house with a canvas bag and $2.30 and her mother's recipes, and she'd used every bit of it not because she was extraordinary. Most of its windows were dark, but because she'd been raised to start where you were, and the place she'd started from happened to be a frozen doorway with a dying man on the other side of it, and there had been no other direction to go but in. What remained at the end of it had always been enough. That was the thing Vernon Slate hadn't understood about Red Willow. He'd looked at it and seen a failing operation, a depressed asset, something that could be made to look worthless so it could be stolen cheap. He'd looked at what was missing and calculated his advantage from the gap. He'd never asked what remained. What remained was a creek that ran through every drought, a family that had come back to itself across 7 years and a kitchen table, 30 neighbors who'd eaten together, and remembered what it meant to be a community of people who depended on each other. A set of survey notebooks carried for 15 years by a woman who hadn't known why she read them, but had carried them anyway because her father had made them, and they were his, and his things were worth keeping. And a jar of apple preserves, 7 years old, made by a woman who'd loved the sound of water and known her land was worth something, and who'd been right, and who'd put up the preserves anyway because you don't stop working toward the future just because the future is uncertain. You put the summer away in jars. You carry the notebooks. You walk through the blizzard because the alternative is standing still in the cold, and that's not something you know how to do. The kitchen at Red Willow was repainted in May. Maeve chose the color not white, not the institutional practicality of the previous paint, but something warmer, a soft cream that held the morning light differently than white did, that made the room feel like itself rather than like a placeholder for something else. Silas looked at it and said it was a perfectly acceptable color. Gideon looked at it and said, "It's exactly right." Maeve looked at his were dark. Maeve looked at it and thought of her mother, who had painted the walls of every kitchen she'd ever worked in because a kitchen was where you spent the hours that held everything else together, and it deserved to look like someone had cared about it. She cared about this one. She realized from the night she'd forced the frozen door open and crossed the threshold and decided without deciding, the way the real decisions happen, The ones that change everything, that this was a place worth fighting for. What she'd found on the other side of that door was not what she'd been hired for. It was larger and harder and more complicated and more expensive in every currency she had time. Energy, fear, the specific cost of allowing herself to want something she hadn't set out to want. Creek was running. The kitchen was warm. The people in it were alive and present and imperfect and hers. And what remained was enough. It had always been enough. She just needed to be the one who looked.